Chapter 1. Before Texas was Texas, long before the name Texas existed, before the flags of Spain, Mexico, or the United States ever flew here. This land was already ancient. Its rivers had been cutting through limestone for millions of years, its prairies swelling and shrinking with the rhythm of changing climates. The wind that whispers across the panhandle today once carried the scent of mammoth herds. Beneath a relentless sky, the land itself told stories. Stories that would shape the people who called it home. The geography of what we now call Texas is vast, almost unruly. To the west, the desert stretches into infinity, broken by rugged mountains like the Guadalupe Range. In the south, the Gulf of Mexico breathes warm, humid air inland, feeding marshes and bays rich with fish and shellfish. The central plains roll in long waves of grass, perfect for game animals and later for grazing herds. And to the east, dense pine forests keep their own secrets, their canopies heavy with moisture, their soil dark and fertile. Between these extremes, rivers thread the land like veins. The Rio Grande carving the southwestern borderlands, the Colorado cutting through the heart of the state, the Brazos, the Trinity, the Red River. These waters were lifelines, sources of food, transportation, and sacred meaning for the first Texans. Long before Europeans arrived, the land was already home to a mosaic of peoples, each shaped by their environment. The Caddo, living in the lush forests and river valleys of East Texas, built villages with carefully thatched conical houses, their communities anchored by central plazas. They were skilled farmers, coaxing corn, beans, and squash from the earth, supplementing their diet with fish and deer. Their pottery was finely made, decorated with geometric designs that told stories without words. The Caddo world was one of diplomacy and ceremony. They developed complex political systems, alliances between villages, and trade routes that carried goods hundreds of miles. From their homelands, pottery and stone tools traveled outward, exchanged for shells from the Gulf, buffalo hides from the plains, and copper from far to the north. Along the Gulf Coast, the Karankawa lived a different rhythm. Tall, strong, and known for their skill with the bow, they followed the cycles of fish and shellfish, moving between the barrier islands and the mainland with the seasons. Their dugout canoes carried them through the lagoons and marshes, and their camps filled with the smell of roasting fish and oysters. They were fiercely protective of their territory, their warriors often painted and adorned for both hunting and battle. To outsiders, the Karankawa could seem mysterious, even threatening, a perception that would linger into the time of European contact. But to themselves, they were simply the people, bound to the Gulf's waters and the spirits that lived there. Farther inland, across the wide plains, the Apache roamed. They were hunters and warriors, their lives tuned to the movement of the buffalo. Long before they had horses, they were formidable on foot, stalking game with bows and spears, their camps light and mobile. The arrival of horses, through trade or capture from other tribes, transformed their world, giving them speed and range. Yet even before that change, the Apache were masters of the open land, knowing which streams would hold water in the dry months, which valleys sheltered game in the winter winds. Their enemies feared their raids. Their allies valued their skill in war. The plains could be harsh, summers of blistering heat, winters of cutting cold. But the Apache adapted, their culture as resilient as the land itself. Then came the Comanche, though not yet the dominant force they would become in later centuries. In this earlier time, Their ancestors lived farther north, but their influence was beginning to press southward. Eventually, they would sweep into Texas on horseback, becoming perhaps the most feared horsemen on the continent. But that is a story for another chapter. For now, the future power struggles were still only a shadow on the horizon. Trade was the thread that bound these diverse peoples together. Trails worn by countless feet crisscrossed the region, carrying not only goods, but stories, songs, and news. A shell from the Gulf might pass through Caddo hands and find itself on the neck of a trader in the Mississippi Valley. Flint from the Edwards Plateau could travel hundreds of miles to the east. The exchange was more than material. It was cultural, spiritual. Along the Red River, Caddo traders might sit by a fire with Wichita visitors. On the Gulf Coast, Karankawa fishermen might meet inland hunters, swapping dried fish for hides. Trust was always fragile, alliances shifting like the wind. But the connections were real. The land itself shaped the rivalries. In the pine forests, territory was measured by the reach of fertile soil and hunting grounds. Along the Gulf, fishing spots and canoe routes could spark disputes. On the plains, the vast herds of buffalo were a treasure worth fighting for. Warfare, when it came, could be brutal. Ambushes at river crossings, swift raids on villages, long pursuits across open country. But just as often, peace was maintained through marriage alliances, ceremonial gatherings, and the careful balancing of power. The climate, too, was a force these peoples could never ignore. Summers brought oppressive heat, making the shade of cottonwoods along a riverbank a precious refuge. Drought could shrink rivers to a trickle, driving tribes to travel farther for water and food. In wet years, the prairies would explode with wildflowers, the rivers swelling with fish. In lean years, hunger could fray even the strongest alliances. Storms off the Gulf could flatten coastal camps, their winds scattering canoes like leaves. Life here required adaptation, and adaptation became a way of life. In the evenings, under the same stars we see today, fires would burn in Caddo villages, in Karankawa camps on the beach, in Apache encampments on the plains. The smell of smoke and cooking meat would mingle with the wind, and the night would fill with voices, telling origin stories, recounting battles, singing the songs that tied them to their ancestors. Each people had its own understanding of the land's creation, its own rules for how to live in balance with it. The rivers were not just water, they were living beings. The animals were not just food, they were gifts to be honored through ritual and respect. This was Texas before it was Texas. A patchwork of landscapes and cultures, each vibrant and self-contained, yet connected by the invisible web of trade, conflict, and tradition. It was a land of abundance and danger, where survival depended on knowledge passed down over generations. The people who lived here did not think of themselves as Texans, or even as part of a single place. They were Caddo, Karankawa, Apache, and many more. Each with their own language, their own gods, their own histories. Far to the south and east, forces were already stirring that would one day send strangers across the ocean, driven by ambition, faith, and the promise of new worlds. But here, in this moment, the land belonged entirely to its first peoples. The rivers still flowed only to them. The buffalo herds thundered across the plains for no one else's gain. The Gulf still gave its fish, only to those who had always known its tides. Soon, sails would appear on the horizon. Footprints of men in armor would press into the sand where Karankawa children played. The trails of trade and friendship would twist into paths of conquest. and disease. But that would come later. For now, the land was whole, and its people still walked it as they always had, masters of their own world, unaware that everything they knew was about to change. Chapter 2. The Spanish Frontier. The world of the Caddo, Karankawa, Apache, and countless others changed not with a single battle, but with the sight of something none of them had ever seen before. Strange, towering shapes rising from the Gulf horizon. To the people watching from the shoreline, the Spanish ships seemed like drifting islands, their sails catching the wind like the wings of enormous birds. Men in glittering metal stepped ashore, their beards thick, their voices strange, their eyes scanning a land they did not know. They had come in search of riches, glory, and the favor of their king. And in doing so, they stepped into a place that would test their endurance in ways they could not imagine. The first Spaniards to walk Texas soil were not conquerors in the way history often imagines, but survivors. In 1528, the expedition of Panfilo de Narvaez had gone terribly wrong. Lost, shipwrecked, starving, the survivors, among them Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, were cast ashore somewhere along the Texas coast, likely near present-day Galveston. For the next 8 years, Cabeza de Vaca and a handful of companions wandered across the continent, moving from the Gulf Coast into the interior, from one group of native peoples to another. Sometimes they were treated as slaves, sometimes as healers, sometimes as guests, but always as outsiders. By the time they finally reached Spanish settlements in Mexico, they carried not gold or conquest, but stories of vast lands, powerful peoples, and whispers of cities filled with treasure. Those whispers were enough to ignite the imagination of Spain's colonial governors. They spoke of the 7 cities of gold, places like Cibola, gleaming in the sun, waiting to be claimed. In 1540, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado led a grand expedition north from Mexico, determined to find them. His route took him across the arid plains, through lands of bison and prairie grass, guided and sometimes misled by native informants. Coronado's men clashed with tribes wary of their intentions, camped through bitter winters, and rode across distances so vast that even their horses staggered. In the end, they found no golden cities, only villages of adobe and earth, and a landscape that tested the patience of any man who dreamed of quick wealth. But in the process, they opened the way for more Spanish exploration into the region that would become Texas. The Spanish learned quickly that this land would not yield its riches easily. Unlike the dense civilizations of central Mexico or the silver mines of Peru, Texas was a patchwork of territories controlled by independent nations, each with its own alliances and rivalries. Conquest here would not be a single war, but an ongoing negotiation, a constant balancing act between military force and fragile friendship. And the land itself was no kinder to the Spaniards than it had been to the peoples who had lived here for centuries. The summers baked the soil to dust, the winters could cut to the bone, and the distances between settlements were measured in days of hard riding. In this remote and often hostile territory, Spain began to plant its footholds through missions and presidios. The missions were not only religious outposts, but engines of transformation, and for many native peoples, of disruption. Built of timber or adobe depending on the region, each mission was a small world, a church at its heart, living quarters for priests and soldiers, workshops for weaving or blacksmithing, and fields where newly converted native laborers grew European crops like wheat and barley. The goal was simple in the eyes of the crown: convert the natives to Christianity, teach them Spanish ways, and bind them into the empire. In practice, it was anything but simple. Some tribes came to the missions willingly, seeking protection from enemies or relief during famine. Others were coerced, their traditions slowly eroded under the weight of an alien faith and foreign laws. To protect these fragile outposts, Spain built presidios, military forts manned by soldiers who were often as far from home as any explorer. Life in a presidio was not the life of a romantic knight-errant. The men drilled in the heat, repaired walls after storms, patrolled endless miles of frontier, and waited for the next supply caravan that might be months late. They faced raids from hostile tribes, disputes with local settlers, and the grinding monotony of isolation. Yet their presence was essential. Without the presidios, the missions would have been easy prey for those who saw them as unwelcome intrusions. The frontier was not simply a matter of Spanish versus native. Alliances formed in unexpected ways. Some tribes traded willingly with the newcomers, exchanging hides, meat, and knowledge of the land for iron tools, cloth, and weapons. Others used the Spaniards as pawns in their own rivalries, offering friendship in exchange for military aid against traditional enemies. A mission might be a place of prayer by day and a fort against raiders by night. And always, just beyond the reach of Spanish authority, the open land remained, wild, untamed, and indifferent to the ambitions of kings. Travel between these scattered settlements was an ordeal in itself. Roads were often little more than worn trails. Rivers had to be forded or bridged with whatever materials could be found. Supplies moved slowly, vulnerable to attack or simply to the harshness of the journey. The men and women who lived in this world learned self-reliance quickly. A blacksmith might also serve as a farmer, a soldier as a hunter, a priest as a physician of sorts. The lines between survival and mission work blurred in the daily reality of the frontier. And yet, even in the midst of hardship, the Spanish presence began to leave its mark. Horses brought by the conquistadors spread beyond their control, becoming the prized possession of tribes who quickly mastered riding. Cattle, goats, and sheep grazed in lands where they had never roamed before. Wheat fields sprouted alongside corn, European fruit trees took root, and adobe and stone architecture began to dot the landscape. Spanish words entered native languages, and native words found their way into the vocabulary of the settlers. Slowly, a cultural borderland emerged. Not purely Spanish, not purely native, but something in between. Still, Spain's hold on Texas was never secure. It was too far from the centers of power in Mexico City, too costly to defend, and too sparsely populated to generate much wealth. The mission struggled to keep converts from drifting back to their old ways. Presidio soldiers sometimes deserted rather than endure another season of isolation. And beyond the Spanish sphere, other European powers began to take notice. The French were pressing westward from Louisiana, traders slipping into territories Spain claimed as its own. Each new rumor of foreign activity in the region sent ripples of alarm through the garrisons and missions. For the native peoples, the Spanish frontier was a mixed reality. Some found opportunity in trade and alliance, gaining new tools, animals, and weapons that altered their way of life. Others suffered devastating losses from European diseases, their populations collapsing under illnesses they had never encountered before. Even those who embraced parts of the Spanish way often found themselves caught in a web of dependency and control. And yet, resistance was never far from the surface. Raids on settlements, attacks on caravans, and refusals to convert kept the frontier in a state of constant tension. By the early 1700s, Texas had become less of a blank spot on Spanish maps and more of a stubborn province, one that demanded attention but rarely rewarded it. Still, the Crown maintained its presence, seeing in Texas a buffer against rivals and a place where the cross of Christ might yet be planted firmly in the soil. Priests continued to preach, soldiers continued to patrol, settlers continued to arrive in small numbers, each wave bringing with it the hope that this time the colony might truly take root. And all the while, the land remained what it had always been: vast, beautiful, and untamed. The Gulf still rolled in with its tides, the plains still stretched toward the horizon, the rivers still cut their winding paths. The people who lived here, whether born under the Spanish flag or not, still contended daily with a place that demanded respect. Every sunrise on the frontier was a reminder that survival here was never guaranteed, no matter what banner flew overhead. This was the Spanish Texas of the frontier era, a fragile network of missions and forts stretched thin across a contested land where faith and steel met the unyielding reality of the wilderness. It was a world in constant motion, shaped by ambition, fear, and the stubborn determination of those who refused to be driven away. Soon that delicate balance would face an even greater test, as new settlers, not soldiers or priests, but families, began to arrive, bringing with them a culture and set of expectations that would shift the destiny of the province forever. Chapter 3: France, Spain, and the struggle for control. The Spanish frontier was fragile, a string of missions and presidios strung across an immense and often hostile land. Its hold on the region depended not only on the cooperation of local tribes, but also on the absence of serious European rivals. For decades, that absence was a given. Spain's claim to Texas stretched from the Gulf to the plains, but in truth, it was a claim more on parchment than on soil. Then, in the closing years of the 17th century, the sails that appeared on the horizon no longer belonged to Spain. They were French. The man behind them was René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de La Salle, an ambitious French explorer whose boldness was matched only by his misfortune. La Salle had already carved his name into maps by navigating the Mississippi River to its mouth, claiming the vast Mississippi Valley for France and naming it Louisiana in honor of King Louis XIV. Now he envisioned an even greater prize, a colony at the mouth of that great river, a base from which France could dominate the interior of North America and threaten Spain's hold on New Spain. The plan was grand, but the Gulf of Mexico was not a forgiving place, and navigation in those days was as much art as science. In 1684, La Salle set sail from France with a small fleet and more than 300 settlers, men, women, even children, along with soldiers and craftsmen. But storms, bad luck, and poor maps drove them far off course. Instead of reaching the Mississippi, La Salle landed hundreds of miles to the west, on the Texas coast near present-day Matagorda Bay. It was a mistake that would set in motion a chain of events far beyond his control. The French built a crude settlement they called Fort St. Louis, little more than a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by the vast emptiness of coastal prairie. Supplies were scarce from the beginning. Relations with nearby native peoples were tense and sometimes violent, and the settlers faced disease, hunger, and the relentless heat of the Texas summer. La Salle, undaunted, made repeated attempts to find the Mississippi overland, disappearing for weeks into the interior with small bands of men. Each journey seemed to lead only to more hardship. The dream of a thriving French colony in the Gulf was slipping away. In 1687, while leading yet another expedition inland, La Salle was murdered by his own men, victims of despair and disillusionment. Without his leadership, Fort St. Louis collapsed into chaos. Attacks by local tribes, starvation, and disease finished what poor planning had begun. When Spanish forces, alerted to the French presence, finally reached the site in 1689, they found only ruins and the grim evidence of a colony that had died hard. But while the French colony itself was short-lived, its impact was enormous. For Spain, the discovery that France had planted a settlement deep in what it considered its own territory was a shock. The idea that another European power could simply arrive and claim a piece of the Gulf Coast forced the Spanish crown to reconsider its approach to Texas. Until then, Spain's interest in the province had been largely strategic. A buffer zone, thinly populated, expensive to maintain, but useful as a shield for the richer lands of New Spain. Now, that buffer looked vulnerable. Spanish expeditions quickly moved to secure the coastline and inland routes. Missions were established farther east than before. Presidios placed in locations chosen as much for defense against Europeans as for control over native populations. The specter of French expansion gave Spanish officials a new urgency. Even the most reluctant colonial governors now argued for the need to hold Texas firmly, not just claim it in theory. For the French, Texas had been an accident, but it was an accident that revealed possibilities. From their base in Louisiana, French traders and explorers began to edge westward, drawn by the promise of trade with Caddo and other tribes. They brought goods the Spanish could not, or would not, match. Muskets, metal tools, colorful cloth, and other European luxuries. For native peoples, the French presence offered both opportunity and leverage. Tribes who had long dealt with Spanish missions could now play one power against the other, bargaining for better terms or switching alliances when it suited them. This uneasy coexistence between European powers in the Gulf region became a defining feature of the early 18th century. Spanish officials accused the French of arming their enemies and luring away potential converts. French traders accused the Spanish of trying to strangle commerce with endless regulations. Both sides knew that open war in this remote borderland was costly and uncertain, so the struggle played out instead in a game of influence. Missions against trading posts, presidio patrols shadowing French expeditions, diplomatic gestures made over shared fires in native villages. The Caddo in East Texas became particularly skilled at navigating this rivalry. Welcoming French traders while entertaining Spanish emissaries, they ensured that neither side could take their loyalty for granted. The Karankawa on the coast, still wary after their encounters with La Salle's settlers, kept their distance from both powers, resisting mission life and avoiding entanglement where they could. The Apache, ranging across the plains, saw in the French a potential source of weapons, and in the Spanish a target for raids, a calculation that would continue to shape their choices. For Spain, the challenge was not simply to push back the French, but to hold their own people in place. Settlers were few, and life in Texas was hard. The missions struggled to maintain their populations. Presidios drained resources from other parts of New Spain. Yet each rumor of French activity, a trading party spotted near the Red River, a new outpost rising in Louisiana, brought fresh orders from Mexico City to strengthen the Spanish grip on the province. The French, for their part, never made another serious attempt to colonize Texas in the way La Salle had. But they did not need to. Their traders could move quickly and lightly, carrying goods deep into the interior without the expense of garrisons or churches. They could befriend, marry into, or ally with tribes in ways the more rigid Spanish system often discouraged. This made them harder to dislodge and, in the eyes of the Spanish, all the more dangerous. And so Texas, in this era, became less a settled colony and more a contested frontier, a place where the ambitions of two European empires met on land, neither fully understood. The coastline, with its bays and rivers, was a door that both France and Spain wished to guard, but neither could close entirely. Inland, the web of alliances and rivalries among native peoples meant that no foreign flag could claim the land completely. The struggle for control was as much about perception as possession. To lose influence was, in many ways, to lose the territory itself. It was a delicate balance, one that could tip with a single misstep. A failed mission, a botched trade deal, a skirmish gone wrong. Each could ripple outward, shifting loyalties and altering the map in ways no European power could fully predict. Yet both France and Spain understood that the Gulf Coast was too important to abandon. For Spain, it was the shield of New Spain. For France, it was a gateway to the interior and a potential dagger aimed at Spanish wealth. In the end, it was not a decisive battle that would resolve this rivalry, but time, persistence, and the shifting fortunes of European politics. Wars fought across the Atlantic would reach into the Gulf. Treaties signed in far-off capitals would redraw borders neither side had truly secured. And the map of North America would be redrawn again and again. But in the years following La Salle's doomed expedition, the struggle for Texas was defined by watchfulness, maneuver, and the knowledge that control was never absolute. The French would remain a presence, visible or not, for decades to come, and their shadow would shape Spanish decisions long after Fort St. Louis had rotted into the prairie grass. The Gulf region was now a chessboard, and Texas one of its most unpredictable squares. Whoever held it would have to contend not just with rival Europeans, but with the land itself and the peoples who had lived there long before either flag appeared. And so the Spanish frontier, already stretched thin, entered a new phase. One in which every alliance had to be weighed, every rumor investigated, every outpost defended against enemies seen and unseen. It was a game Spain could not afford to lose. But as new currents of settlers, traders, and soldiers began to flow into Texas, the balance of the frontier would shift again, setting the stage for a different kind of conflict. One not just between empires, but between cultures and peoples who would decide, in their own ways, the fate of this contested land. Chapter 4. Mexican Texas. The struggle between Spain and France in the Gulf eventually faded, not through conquest on Texan soil, but because of decisions made an ocean away. Wars in Europe, shifting alliances, and treaties signed in distant courts redefined borders yet again. By the early 19th century, Spain's grip on Texas seemed more secure on paper than it had in generations. Yet while no foreign flag flew over its missions and presidios, unrest was growing within the empire itself. The challenge that would shape Texas next would not come from France, but from within Spain's own American territories. In 1810, far to the south in the town of Dolores, a Catholic priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla rang the church bell and called for the people to rise against Spanish rule. His Grito de Dolores ignited the Mexican War of Independence, a struggle that would rage for more than a decade. The conflict spread across New Spain. Battles, sieges, and shifting allegiances pulling in soldiers, peasants, and revolutionaries alike. Texas, remote as it was, did not escape the ripples. Rebel bands entered the province, sometimes clashing with royalist troops, sometimes seeking support from local settlers or native allies. The frontier became a dangerous place for anyone loyal to the old order. By 1821, Spain's centuries-long rule over Mexico came to an end. The Treaty of Cordoba recognized Mexican independence, and the sprawling territory that had been New Spain became the new Mexican Empire. Texas was now part of a vast, young nation still finding its identity. The change was as sudden as it was profound. Royal governors were replaced by Mexican officials, Spanish flags came down, and the laws of a new republic, later a federal republic, began to take shape. For the leaders in Mexico City, Texas was a distant and sparsely populated province, rich in land but poor in people. The native nations still commanded much of the territory, and the small number of Spanish and Mexican settlers clustered around missions, ranches, and presidios were too few to secure it. Mexico's northern frontier was vulnerable not only to raids from Comanche and Apache, but also to encroachment by the United States, whose borders now pressed along the Sabine River after the Adams-Onis Treaty. To protect and develop Texas, Mexico turned to a strategy it had already seen work elsewhere: immigration. The government passed colonization laws encouraging settlement by offering land to those willing to cultivate it, with the understanding that these new residents would swear loyalty to Mexico, become Catholics, and obey Mexican law. To manage this influx, Mexico employed impresarios, land agents authorized to recruit settlers, grant land, and oversee the establishment of communities. One impresario would come to define this era more than any other: Stephen Fuller Austin, the son of Moses Austin, a businessman who had secured permission from Spanish authorities to settle Anglo families in Texas shortly before Mexico's independence. Stephen found himself holding his father's grant after Moses died in 1821. Determined to carry it out, Austin negotiated with the new Mexican government and received confirmation of his rights. He set about recruiting settlers, mainly from the southern United States, offering them fertile land along the Brazos and Colorado rivers. The offer was irresistible to many. For the price of modest fees and a pledge to follow Mexican law, a family could receive hundreds of acres, a fortune compared to what was available back home. By the mid-1820s, the Old 300, as Austin's first colonists would be remembered, were establishing farms and homesteads, clearing fields, building cabins, and planting crops. More impresarios followed, bringing thousands of settlers into Texas in a matter of years. At first, the arrangement seemed mutually beneficial. Mexico gained a growing population that could farm the land, defend against hostile tribes, and strengthen claims to the province. The settlers gained vast tracts of land and a fresh start. Austin himself became a skilled diplomat, working tirelessly to keep relations smooth between his colonists and the Mexican authorities. He learned Spanish, navigated the bureaucracy of Mexico City, and earned a reputation as a trustworthy intermediary. But beneath the surface, tensions were forming. The settlers, most of them from the United States, brought with them not only their language and customs, but also the institution of slavery, which Mexico had begun to restrict. Many of the Anglo colonists were Protestant, in open contrast to Mexico's official Catholic faith. Laws were written in Spanish, court proceedings conducted in a language most newcomers did not speak. Cultural misunderstandings multiplied. Mexican officials expected settlers to integrate into the existing legal and social framework, to participate in local governance under Mexican laws, and to adopt the trappings of Mexican citizenship. Many settlers, however, saw themselves as self-reliant pioneers, living under Mexican authority only in name. The wide distances between settlements and the provincial capital in San Antonio made enforcement of laws inconsistent, and local authorities often turned a blind eye to infractions if it kept the peace. The frontier itself added to the tension. Raids by Comanche and Apache did not stop simply because new settlers had arrived. Many Anglo colonists had little experience dealing with these tribes, and some responded with open hostility, further destabilizing relations in areas where Mexican officials had long balanced diplomacy with defense. At the same time, trade ties with the United States deepened. Goods, tools, and weapons crossed the Sabine more frequently than they came from the interior of Mexico, making Texas economically tied as much to the north as to the south. Austin worked to bridge these growing divides. He urged his settlers to follow Mexican law, to present themselves as loyal citizens, and to avoid actions that might provoke distrust from the authorities. He traveled repeatedly to Mexico City to secure favorable terms for his colony, at times spending months away from Texas to lobby for policies that would protect his settlers' interests. His efforts often succeeded in delaying conflict, but the cultural gap between the Anglo immigrants and the Mexican government remained stubbornly wide. Meanwhile, the population of Texas was changing rapidly. By the end of the 1820s, Anglos outnumbered Tejanos, Texans of Mexican descent, in many areas, particularly in Austin's colony. The newcomers formed their own communities, built schools where English was spoken, and maintained customs from their former homes. Some married into Tejano families and embraced aspects of Mexican culture, but many others kept their distance, viewing the Mexican legal system and Catholic Church with suspicion. The Mexican government began to take notice. Concerns grew in Mexico City that Texas, with its swelling Anglo-American population, might not remain loyal in the long term. Some officials worried openly that the United States still harbored ambitions to annex the province, using the settlers as a foothold. Reports from the frontier described settlers ignoring the requirement to convert to Catholicism, flouting restrictions on slavery, and trading almost exclusively with the United States. Yet, even as suspicion rose, Mexico continued to approve new impresario contracts. The lure of rapid development was strong, and many Mexican officials believed that with the right policies, the settlers could be fully integrated. But integration was proving harder than they had imagined. The sheer distance from the heart of Mexico made Texas feel like a place apart, a place where local conditions mattered more than decrees from the capital. By the end of the decade, the seeds of future conflict had already been planted. The success of the impresario system had transformed Texas from a sparsely populated frontier into a province with a rapidly expanding, culturally mixed population. But it had also created a patchwork of communities with different loyalties, languages, and laws. For now, the fragile cooperation between Mexican authorities and the settlers held, thanks in large part to men like Stephen F. Austin, who could navigate both worlds. Still, there was a sense, subtle but growing, that the balance could not last forever. The land that had once been a remote edge of the Spanish Empire was now a meeting ground of nations, cultures, and ambitions. Mexico's experiment in populating its northern frontier had succeeded in bringing people, but it had also brought contradictions that could not easily be reconciled. For the moment, Texas was Mexican, bound by law and treaty, defended by its new citizens, and still officially loyal to the Republic. But loyalty is a fragile thing, especially on a frontier where the pull of opportunity often outweighs the pull of distant authority. And in the quiet spaces between the river valleys and the missions, between the New Anglo farms and the old Tejano ranches, tensions were building. The next chapter of Texas history would see those tensions take on a sharper edge, as misunderstandings hardened into disputes, and disputes edged closer to open conflict. Chapter 5. Seeds of Rebellion. By the end of the 1820s, the population of Texas had grown faster than even its most optimistic supporters in Mexico City had expected. Anglo settlers were building farms, raising livestock, and establishing small towns. Tejano ranches continued to operate alongside these new communities, and for a time, the mixture of cultures brought a sense of energy to the province. But under the surface, the friction between Mexico's laws and the settlers' expectations was becoming harder to ignore. One of the deepest points of contention was slavery. When Mexico won its independence from Spain, it inherited a legal system that did not fully ban the practice. But the country's leaders viewed slavery as incompatible with the ideals of the new republic. In 1829, Mexico officially abolished slavery throughout the nation. The law made allowances for Texas, where the economy of many Anglo settlers depended on enslaved labor, particularly for cotton farming. These allowances were meant to be temporary, but they set off alarm bells for those who had staked their livelihoods on the institution. To many Anglos from the southern United States, slavery was not only an economic tool, but also a social system they considered non-negotiable. Some settlers skirted the law by converting enslaved people into indentured servants under contracts that could last decades. Slavery in all but name. Mexican officials saw these maneuvers for what they were, but enforcement was difficult in a province so far from the capital. Each attempt to limit slavery reinforced the suspicion among Anglo settlers that Mexico was moving toward abolishing it entirely in Texas. To those settlers, such a move would be more than an inconvenience. It would be a threat to the foundation of their way of life. Religion was another fault line. Mexico was, by law, a Catholic nation. All settlers were expected to convert, at least formally, and public worship outside the Catholic Church was prohibited. In reality, many Anglo settlers remained Protestant, holding informal services in their homes or meeting outdoors. Some simply ignored the requirement to convert altogether. For Tejano communities, Catholicism was a familiar and binding force, central to public life. For many of the new arrivals, it was a formality they resented, seeing it as a government intrusion into personal belief. The gap between official policy and everyday practice was wide, but the very existence of the rule became a symbol of cultural difference. Language deepened the divide. Mexican law and governance were conducted in Spanish, but most of the Anglos spoke only English. Legal documents, court proceedings, and land titles often required translation, and misunderstandings, some genuine, others convenient, became common. In many Anglo settlements, Spanish was rarely heard, further isolating these communities from the Tejano towns and from the officials sent to govern them. What to Mexican authorities looked like stubborn refusal to integrate, settlers saw as practical necessity. They lived among people who spoke their own language, and they traded more often with Louisiana than with the interior of Mexico. Yet the most explosive issue was self-governance. Under the Mexican Constitution of 1824, Texas was not its own state, but part of the larger state of Coahuila y Texas, with the state capital far away in Saltillo. Representation was limited, and decisions affecting Texas often came from leaders who had never set foot there. Many settlers wanted Texas to be its own state within the Mexican Federation, with its own capital, legislature, and control over local affairs. Tejanos, too, sometimes supported this idea, believing it would bring resources and attention to their province. But in Mexico City, such talk sounded dangerously close to separatism, especially given Texas's growing Anglo population and its ties to the United States. In 1828, a Mexican inspection tour led by General Manuel de Mier y Terán delivered a sobering report to the government. Traveling through Texas, Mier y Terán found that in many areas, Anglos vastly outnumbered Mexican citizens. He noted that trade with the United States was flourishing, while ties to the rest of Mexico were weak. If the trend continued, he warned, Texas could easily slip from Mexico's grasp, whether through annexation by the United States or by declaring independence outright. His report concluded that without stronger Mexican presence and control, the province would be lost. The response was swift and far-reaching. On April 6, 1830, the Mexican government passed a law that struck at the heart of Anglo settlement. The law of April 6th banned further immigration from the United States, aiming to halt the flood of Anglo settlers into Texas. It also canceled unfulfilled impresario contracts, increased military presence, and imposed customs duties on goods from the U.S. For Anglo settlers, it felt like a betrayal, a reversal of the very policies that had brought them to Texas. To Mexican officials, it was a necessary measure to preserve sovereignty over a province that was beginning to look more American than Mexican. The law's impact was immediate. Families waiting to join relatives in Texas found themselves barred from entry. Settlers who relied on imported goods now faced taxes that cut into their profits. Military garrisons expanded, and new customs houses were built to enforce the trade restrictions. Friction flared in port towns where soldiers tried to collect duties from traders accustomed to free movement. In some communities, protests turned into open defiance, with settlers refusing to pay or smuggling goods across the Sabine River under cover of night. Tensions rose further in 1832 at the town of Anahuac, where Mexican commander Juan Davis Bradburn enforced the new laws with particular zeal. Bradburn, himself a Virginian who had served in the Mexican army, angered local settlers by using their labor without pay for fort construction and by arresting those who resisted. When he jailed two prominent settlers, William B. Travis and Patrick C. Jack, for defying his authority, an armed group gathered to demand their release. The standoff at Anahuac ended with Bradburn's removal, but the incident left deep scars. It showed that settlers were willing to take up arms against Mexican authority, and that they could win concessions by doing so. At the same time, not all settlers were eager for confrontation. Stephen F. Austin continued to urge patience and legal appeals, warning that rash actions could destroy the fragile relationship with Mexico. Many Tejanos also counseled caution, fearing that outright rebellion would bring chaos to their communities. Yet the cycle of mistrust was hard to break. Every crackdown from Mexican officials convinced more settlers that Mexico was hostile to their interests. Every act of defiance from settlers convinced Mexico City that Texas was on the brink of insurrection. The law of April 6th did more than restrict immigration. It hardened identities. Anglos began to see themselves less as Mexican citizens and more as a distinct people with their own needs and rights. Tejano leaders who had once welcomed Anglo settlement began to feel squeezed between two worlds, unsure whether Mexico could meet Texas's demands or whether the Anglos could ever fully accept Mexican rule. Meanwhile, unrest was not confined to Texas. Across Mexico, political instability weakened the central government's ability to address frontier issues. Coups, changes in leadership, and power struggles between Federalists and Centralists meant that policies toward Texas shifted from leniency to rigidity and back again. To settlers on the ground, it often seemed that Mexico's attention was elsewhere, except when it came to enforcing unpopular laws. By the early 1830s, Texas had become a place where small disputes could quickly escalate. A customs duty here, an arrest there. Each incident added to a growing sense that the gap between settlers and the Mexican government was no longer a matter of misunderstanding, but of incompatible visions for the province's future. Slavery, religion, language, and self-governance were no longer isolated issues. They had become threads woven into a single, tightening knot. Yet open rebellion was not yet inevitable. Many in Texas still believed compromise was possible. Petitions circulated calling for the repeal of the April 6th law, for greater representation, and for the recognition of Texas as a separate state within Mexico. These efforts reflected a hope that the relationship could be repaired without bloodshed. But hope was becoming harder to sustain. The mistrust that had taken root in the last decade was growing like a thorn bush, ready to draw blood at the slightest touch. The seeds of rebellion had been planted, watered by suspicion and fertilized by each new clash of authority. They had not yet sprouted into full-grown revolution, but the ground was ready. And in the years to come, events would test whether those seeds could still be pulled up, or whether they would grow into something far more difficult to contain. Chapter 6. The Texas Revolution. By the mid-1830s, the knot of tensions in Texas had been pulled so tight that every new dispute threatened to snap it. Petitions to Mexico City for reform had been met with delays, half measures, or outright refusals. Political instability in Mexico deepened the mistrust. Presidents rose and fell with alarming speed, and the debate between Federalist and Centralist visions of government left provinces like Texas caught in the crossfire. When Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna came to power in 1833 as a Federalist, many in Texas hoped he would support their calls for statehood and greater autonomy. Stephen F. Austin even traveled to Mexico City to negotiate directly. At first, there were signs of progress. But Santa Anna soon revealed a different course, shifting to a centralist government that concentrated power in Mexico City and dissolved the state legislatures. Local control, the very thing Texas settlers had been fighting to strengthen, was swept aside. For the settlers, this was the breaking point. In their eyes, the Mexican government had moved from neglecting their needs to actively stripping away their rights. The distrust that had been building for years began to harden into open defiance. When Austin returned from Mexico in 1835 after months of imprisonment, suspected of treason for writing a letter that hinted at independent statehood, his message was grim. The differences between Texas and the central government could no longer be bridged by words alone. The first shots of the revolution came in October 1835, in the small town of Gonzales. Mexican authorities had sent soldiers to retrieve a small cannon that had been given to the settlers years earlier for defense against native raids. The settlers refused, rallying under a hastily made flag that bore the words, "Come and take it," beneath a black star and an image of the cannon. When the Mexican detachment attempted to seize it, Texan militia opened fire. The skirmish was brief and not especially bloody, but its symbolic power was enormous. Gonzales was hailed as the Lexington of Texas, the moment when protest had turned into armed rebellion. From Gonzales, the Texian forces, a mix of Anglo settlers, Tejanto allies, and volunteers from the United States, moved quickly. They captured the town of Goliad, taking control of a key fort and cutting off Mexican troops from their supply lines along the coast. These early victories were as much about momentum as territory, giving the rebels confidence and a sense that perhaps the Mexican army could be pushed out of Texas entirely. In December 1835, Texian forces laid siege to San Antonio de Bexar, where Mexican General Martín Perfecto de Cos had fortified his position. For weeks, the two sides traded sporadic gunfire and endured the cold winter. In mid-December, the Texians launched a daring assault, fighting their way through the streets in brutal house-to-house combat. After several days, Cos surrendered, agreeing to withdraw his troops from Texas. The rebels celebrated. The Mexican army had been driven out of the province, at least for the moment. But the victory at Bexar would prove deceptive. Santa Anna was determined to crush the rebellion personally. Gathering a large army, he marched north in the winter of 1836, a feat of endurance that brought thousands of Mexican troops into Texas far sooner than the rebels had expected. His first target was San Antonio, where a small Texian garrison held the old mission known as the Alamo. The defenders of the Alamo were a mix of men from different backgrounds. William B. Travis, a young commander determined to hold the fort. Jim Bowie, a frontier fighter known for his knife and his grit. And Davy Crockett, a former Tennessee congressman whose frontier legend had already reached mythic proportions. They were joined by fewer than 200 soldiers, facing an army of several thousand. Santa Anna's forces arrived in late February, surrounding the Alamo and demanding its surrender. Travis's reply was defiant. A cannon shot fired in response. For 13 days, the siege dragged on. Mexican artillery pounded the walls, while inside the mission, the defenders rationed food and ammunition, sending out desperate calls for reinforcements. On the morning of March 6th, Santa Anna ordered the final assault. His troops swarmed the walls in waves, overwhelming the defenders in fierce close-quarters combat. By sunrise, the Alamo had fallen. Almost all the defenders were killed. Only a few civilians were spared to tell the tale. News of the Alamo's fall spread like wildfire, becoming a rallying cry for the Texian cause. Remember the Alamo began to echo across the camps and settlements, a call for both vengeance and unity. But even as they mourned the loss, the Texians faced another disaster. At Goliad, a force under Colonel James Fannin was surrounded by Mexican troops near Colito Creek. After a brief but intense battle, Fannin surrendered, believing his men would be treated as prisoners of war. Instead, under orders from Santa Anna, more than 300 Texian prisoners were executed in what became known as the Goliad Massacre. The combined shock of the Alamo and Goliad had a paradoxical effect. On one hand, it revealed the brutal resolve of the Mexican army and the vulnerability of the Texian forces. On the other, it ignited a determination to fight on with renewed fury. Volunteers poured in, some from within Texas, others crossing the border from the United States, drawn by sympathy, ideology, or the lure of adventure. In the spring of 1836, the Texian army, now under the command of General Sam Houston, was in retreat, avoiding direct confrontation with Santa Anna's superior numbers. Houston's strategy was deliberate. Preserve the army until the right moment to strike. This meant weeks of tense marching, as civilians fled eastward in what became known as the Runaway Scrape, abandoning homes and farms to escape the advancing Mexican forces. That moment came on April 21st, 1836, near the banks of the San Jacinto River. Santa Anna had camped his army in a seemingly secure position, unaware that Houston was ready to attack. In the afternoon, Houston's forces, numbering about 900, charged the Mexican camp, catching the soldiers off guard during their rest. The battle was over in less than 20 minutes. The Texians swept through the camp, shouting, "Remember the Alamo! Remember Goliad!" The Mexican army collapsed in confusion and panic. Santa Anna himself was captured the following day, disguised in a private's uniform. Brought before Houston, he agreed to terms that effectively ended the fighting in Texas. Although the formal recognition of Texas's independence would be a matter for later negotiation, the victory at San Jacinto secured the rebels' control over the province and turned the tide irreversibly in their favor. In the span of just 7 months, Texas had gone from tense but uneasy province of Mexico to a land seized by armed rebellion, its cause fueled by the blood of Gonzales, the defiance of the Alamo, the tragedy at Goliad, and the triumph at San Jacinto. The events had forged legends of Crockett, Bowie, and Travis, of Houston's leadership, of ordinary settlers and Tejano allies who risked everything for a cause that had no guarantee of success. The revolution was over, but the fate of Texas was far from settled. Independence brought its own challenges. A new government to form, borders to defend, debts to manage, and the ever-present question of how long the fledgling republic could survive on its own. For now, though, the people of Texas celebrated, their victory songs rising into the same open sky that had watched their long and bloody struggle for freedom. Chapter 7. The Republic of Texas. The cheers of San Jacinto still echoed across the prairie when the harder truth began to settle in. Victory had given Texas independence, but it had not given her stability. In April 1836, the dream of a free republic was fresh and exhilarating. Flags were raised, toasts were made, and the stories of the Alamo, Goliad, and San Jacinto were told with pride around every campfire. But the celebration was short. Independence was a promise, not a finished reality, and the work of building a nation began in a land still scarred by war. The new Republic of Texas declared its independence on March 2, 1836. But only now could it begin to act like a country. A constitution, modeled closely on that of the United States, was already in place. It provided for a president, a Congress, and a judiciary. It recognized the right to own slaves, reflecting the influence of many Anglo settlers from the American South. It promised liberty, but that liberty was not extended to everyone. Native peoples were excluded from citizenship, and free black residents faced restrictions that would tighten over time. Sam Houston, the hero of San Jacinto, was elected the first president in September 1836. His election was a clear signal that the people wanted the same calm leadership that had brought them victory in war to guide them in peace. Houston inherited a republic that was both fragile and ambitious, full of high hopes and empty coffers. The government had almost no money, and the war had left debts that would haunt Texas for years. The printing of paper currency, Texas money, began almost immediately, but without hard assets to back it, its value was unstable. Diplomacy became the first urgent task. The United States, sympathetic to Texas from the beginning, quickly recognized the new republic, but Mexico did not. For the government in Mexico City, Texas was not a foreign nation, but a rebellious province to be reclaimed. Santa Anna, still a prisoner, had signed agreements promising to end hostilities and recognize Texas's independence. But the Mexican government refused to honor them, arguing they had been made under duress. Raids and skirmishes along the border would continue, a constant reminder that independence was under threat. Relations with the United States were warmer, but not without complexity. Many in Texas wanted immediate annexation, believing that joining the Union would provide security and economic opportunity. But the U.S. government hesitated. The addition of Texas, a large slave-holding territory, threatened to upset the delicate balance between free and slave states. It also risked war with Mexico, which still considered Texas part of its territory. For now, Texas would remain independent, even as it leaned heavily on American trade, migration, and goodwill. Within the Republic, life was a mixture of hardship and optimism. Towns that had been emptied during the runaway scrape began to refill. New settlers arrived from the United States, drawn by the promise of cheap land and a fresh start. Land grants were a cornerstone of the government's policy, rewarding veterans with acreage and using the prospect of ownership to attract immigrants. But settlement also pushed deeper into lands claimed by native nations, setting the stage for conflict. Houston, aware of the limits of Texas's military strength, pursued a policy of negotiation with tribes like the Comanche, Kiowa, and Cherokee. He believed that treaties, trade, and clearly defined boundaries could reduce bloodshed. Some agreements were made, but trust was thin. Many settlers saw native peoples not as neighbors, but as obstacles. And the pressure for more land meant that even the best-intentioned treaties were often ignored or broken. Raids and reprisals on both sides would remain a constant feature of frontier life. The heroes of the Revolution became the living symbols of the young republic. Houston was not only president, but also a national icon. His name spoken with the same reverence as the memory of Travis, Bowie, and Crockett. Other figures, Edward Burleson, Mirabeau B. Lamar, Thomas Rusk, took on leadership roles in the new government. Yet politics in Texas was as fierce as any battlefield. Disagreements over spending, military policy, relations with native nations, and the question of annexation divided the political class into factions. The army, small and often unpaid, was restless. Many officers and men wanted to take the fight back to Mexico, arguing that the only way to secure independence was to capture more territory and force recognition through strength. Houston, by contrast, sought to avoid provoking Mexico into another full-scale war the Republic could ill afford. This difference in vision led to tensions between the civilian government and the military, and at times came close to open confrontation. Economically, Texas struggled. The war had disrupted farming and trade, and rebuilding was slow. The ports of Galveston and Velasco began to see more traffic, but revenues from tariffs and land sales could not keep pace with the costs of running a government, maintaining an army, and defending a long, porous frontier. Inflation eroded confidence in the paper currency, and merchants often preferred to be paid in goods or hard coin rather than in notes from the Republic of Texas. Despite these challenges, there was a powerful sense of possibility in the air. Independence meant the freedom to shape the laws, culture, and destiny of the land, without oversight from a distant capital. Settlers planted crops in newly claimed fields, ranchers rebuilt herds lost during the war, and small businesses opened to serve the needs of growing communities. Newspapers appeared, carrying both local gossip and debates over the great questions of the day. Churches were built, schools were founded, and in some towns, theater performances and dances offered moments of levity amid the hard work of nation building. The Republic's boundaries, though claimed on paper, were far less clear in practice. Texas insisted that its territory extended to the Rio Grande, encompassing parts of what is now New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. Mexico, however, maintained that the Nueces River marked the true boundary. Between those rivers lay a vast stretch of contested land, thinly populated and often lawless, where raiding parties, outlaws, and shifting alliances made life unpredictable. Native nations, caught between the expanding settlements and the competing claims of Mexico and Texas, navigated the shifting balance of power as best they could. Some traded with Texan communities, exchanging horses, hides, and goods. Others resisted encroachment fiercely, striking at isolated farms and small towns before retreating into the plains. The Republic's inability to fully control its own frontier underscored the reality that independence had not magically solved the problems of the land. It had simply placed them in the hands of a new government. Mirabeau B. Lamar, who succeeded Houston as president in 1838, brought a sharply different approach to many of these issues. He rejected annexation to the United States, envisioning Texas as a great independent nation stretching to the Pacific. He also took a far harder line against native peoples, advocating removal rather than coexistence. His policies led to costly conflicts, especially with the Comanche, and further strained the Republic's finances. By the early 1840s, the Republic of Texas was deeply in debt, its paper money almost worthless, and its future uncertain. Diplomatic efforts to gain recognition from European powers met with limited success. Britain and France extended formal recognition, partly as a way to check U.S. influence in North America, but neither was willing to provide the kind of military support that could deter Mexico. Raids from across the border continued, sometimes little more than brief incursions, other times organized campaigns to reclaim lost territory. Yet even in its most difficult moments, the Republic endured. The idea of Texas, a land wrested from Mexico by courage and sacrifice, a nation built by settlers and revolutionaries, retained its hold on the imagination of its people. Public life revolved around the stories of those who had fought at the Alamo, who had survived Goliad, who had ridden with Houston at San Jacinto. These stories were more than just history. They were the foundation of a shared identity, binding together people from many backgrounds in the belief that they had created something unique on the North American frontier. Life in the Republic of Texas was rarely easy. The threats were real, from Mexico, from hostile raids, from economic hardship. But so was the pride. Each obstacle faced and survived reinforced the belief that Texas had been won through determination and could be kept the same way. In the fields, on the trails, in the halls of government, the work of making that belief into lasting reality continued day by day. But beneath the pride and the perseverance, another truth lingered. The Republic's debts grew heavier, its security more uncertain, and the question of whether Texas could stand alone became harder to ignore. Some still dreamed of a powerful, independent Texas. Others looked again to the United States, seeing in annexation not surrender, but salvation. For now, those debates remained unsettled, simmering beneath the surface as the Republic carried on, proud and precarious, into the next chapter of its story. Chapter 8: Annexation and the Road to War. By the early 1840s, the Republic of Texas was caught between pride and necessity. Nearly a decade of independence had produced moments of triumph, but also a deepening sense that the experiment could not last forever. The debt was staggering, the currency unstable, and the constant threat from Mexico meant that the Republic's very survival required either a dramatic change in fortune or the protection of a stronger power. For many Texans, that stronger power was obvious: the United States. Annexation had been discussed almost from the moment Texas declared independence, but in the early years it had found little traction in Washington. In 1836, President Andrew Jackson had recognized Texas as an independent nation, but he avoided annexation for fear of provoking war with Mexico and upsetting the fragile balance between free and slave states. Texas's constitution allowed slavery, and bringing the Republic into the Union would add a large slaveholding territory, likely as several new states, strengthening the political power of the South. This was a prospect that many in the North resisted. In Austin, the idea of annexation was not without its opponents. Some leaders, like Mirabeau B. Lamar, dreamed of a vast, independent Texas stretching westward toward the Pacific. They feared that joining the Union would reduce Texas to just another state, its sovereignty swallowed by a larger government. Others simply doubted that the United States would truly protect Texas's interests in the long run. But these voices were increasingly drowned out by the reality of Texas's precarious position. Mexico's refusal to recognize Texas independence was not just a diplomatic slight. It was a standing threat. Raids across the Rio Grande, sporadic but alarming, reminded Texans that Mexico had not given up its claim. In 1842, Mexican forces under General Adrian Vall even managed to seize San Antonio for a brief period before withdrawing. These incidents underscored how vulnerable Texas remained. Without the manpower and resources to defend its long frontier indefinitely, the Republic's leaders faced a stark choice: find a way to secure lasting peace or seek the protection of a stronger ally. Sam Houston, returning to the presidency in 1841, was firmly in the annexation camp. He pursued a patient strategy, strengthening Texas's diplomatic ties with Britain and France, while making it clear to the United States that Texas was willing to remain independent if necessary. The hope was that by courting European interest, Texas could pressure Washington into action. Britain, in particular, saw value in an independent Texas as a counterweight to U.S. expansion and as a potential partner in trade, especially for cotton. But this very possibility alarmed many in the United States, who feared that European influence so close to American borders would threaten their own security and ambitions. By 1844, annexation had become a central issue in American politics. President John Tyler, an independent-minded Virginian who had clashed with his own Whig party, saw the annexation of Texas as a chance to secure his legacy. Negotiations between Tyler's administration and Texas moved quickly, resulting in a proposed treaty that would bring Texas into the Union. But in the U.S. Senate, the treaty faced fierce opposition. Northern senators opposed it on anti-slavery grounds. Others feared war with Mexico. In June 1844, the treaty was rejected by a wide margin. The rejection might have ended the matter, but the presidential election that year brought the issue roaring back. Democrat James K. Polk ran on a platform of expansion, embracing the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Polk supported the annexation of Texas and the acquisition of Oregon, appealing to voters eager for national growth. His victory over Whig candidate Henry Clay was seen as a mandate for expansion. In the closing days of his presidency, Tyler seized the moment. Rather than risk another treaty rejection, he pushed for annexation through a joint resolution of Congress, which required only a simple majority in both houses. In February 1845, the resolution passed, offering Texas admission to the Union as a state with the right to keep its public lands and the option to divide into as many as 5 states in the future. The terms also allowed Texas to maintain slavery, further cementing its identity as a Southern stronghold. In Austin, the proposal stirred both excitement and unease. For most Texans, the benefits outweighed the concerns. Annexation promised military protection, economic stability, and the legitimacy of joining a recognized nation. On July 4, 1845, a special convention voted overwhelmingly in favor of joining the United States. That autumn, Texans ratified a new state constitution, and on December 29, 1845, President Polk signed the resolution formally admitting Texas as the 28th state of the Union. Celebrations erupted across Texas, but in Mexico City, the reaction was outrage. The Mexican government had long warned that annexation would be considered an act of war. To them, Texas was still Mexican territory, temporarily lost to rebellion, but never lawfully ceded. The United States, by accepting Texas into the Union, had in their eyes stolen a province by force. Diplomatic relations between the two nations were severed, and both sides began preparing for the possibility of armed conflict. The immediate flashpoint was the boundary. Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its southern border, citing the treaties of Velasco signed by Santa Anna after his capture at San Jacinto. Mexico, however, insisted that the border lay at the Nueces River, well to the north. The disputed strip of land between the two rivers was sparsely populated, but strategically significant. For Texas, and now for the United States, yielding the territory would mean conceding part of what they believed was rightfully theirs. For Mexico, allowing U.S. troops to occupy the land would be tantamount to surrendering without a fight. President Polk, an ardent expansionist, saw the dispute as an opportunity as well as a danger. Even before Texas's formal admission, he had begun considering how to resolve the border issue and how to acquire California and other Mexican territories in the bargain. In early 1846, he ordered General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into the disputed territory, stationing them near the Rio Grande. To Polk, this was a defensive measure. To Mexico, it was an invasion. In the months following annexation, the atmosphere along the southern frontier was tense. Skirmishes between Mexican and U.S. forces became more likely with each passing week, and political rhetoric on both sides hardened. In Washington, many argued that the United States had every right to defend its new states' claimed borders. In Mexico City, leaders insisted that they would not cede 1 inch of soil without a fight. While the armies watched each other across the disputed land, ordinary Texans adjusted to life as Americans. Statehood brought new opportunities: representation in Congress, access to U.S. markets, and the protection of the U.S. Army. But it also brought them into the center of a larger geopolitical struggle. What had begun as a local rebellion against Mexican authority was now a matter of national pride and territorial ambition for two countries. The annexation of Texas was more than a political agreement. It was the ignition point for a chain of events that would soon engulf the continent. In the jubilant halls of Austin and the crowded chambers of Washington, the moment was celebrated as a triumph of will and destiny. In Mexico City, it was mourned as the theft of a province and the humiliation of a nation. Neither side intended to back down. The ink on the annexation documents was barely dry when the soldiers along the Rio Grande prepared for the possibility that the next order they received would send them into battle. The road from independence to annexation had been long and complicated, filled with diplomacy, political maneuvering, and the competing visions of leaders in Austin and Washington. But now, the road ahead led to something far more dangerous. A war that would decide not just the fate of Texas, but the balance of power in North America. Chapter 9: War and Borders. The annexation of Texas had been celebrated in the United States and in Texas itself as the fulfillment of destiny. But in Mexico City, it was seen as a provocation too great to ignore. The government of Mexico, already unstable from years of political upheaval, refused to recognize Texas's entry into the Union. To them, it was not a state, but a rebellious province, and the United States had committed an act of theft. War was no longer a remote possibility. It was a question of when and where the first shots would be fired. The border dispute gave both sides a tangible cause. Texas, now speaking with the voice of the United States, claimed the Rio Grande as its southern boundary, based on the treaties of Velasco signed after San Jacinto. Mexico rejected those treaties, arguing that they were signed under duress and therefore invalid. For Mexico, the true border was the Nueces River, more than 100 miles to the north. Between these two rivers lay a stretch of contested land, sparsely populated, largely ungoverned, but fiercely claimed by both nations. President James K. Polk was not content to wait for Mexico to act. Determined to assert American claims, he ordered General Zachary Taylor to move U.S. troops into the disputed territory. Taylor marched south to the banks of the Rio Grande in early 1846, building a fort directly across from the Mexican city of Matamoros. To Polk, this was a defensive measure to protect Texas. To Mexico, it was an invasion. The standoff could not last. In April 1846, a Mexican cavalry unit clashed with a U.S. patrol north of the Rio Grande, leaving several Americans dead or captured. Polk seized on the incident, declaring to Congress that American blood has been shed on American soil. Congress responded with a declaration of war on May 13, 1846. The United States was now at war with Mexico, and Texas, the newest state in the Union, was suddenly on the front lines of an international conflict. For Texans, the war was personal. Many had fought in the Revolution against Mexico less than a decade earlier, and now they saw a chance to settle old scores and secure the border once and for all. Volunteers flooded into the U.S. Army from across the state, joining both regular units and independent companies. The Rangers, already known for their skill in frontier warfare, were enlisted as scouts and irregular cavalry, tasked with reconnaissance, raiding, and guiding U.S. forces through unfamiliar terrain. Their hit-and-run tactics and ability to move swiftly through hostile territory earned them both admiration and fear. The opening battles of the war were fought in and near Texas. In May 1846, Taylor's forces clashed with the Mexican army at Palo Alto, just north of present-day Brownsville. The battle unfolded on open prairie, where U.S. artillery proved decisive, pounding Mexican lines and forcing a retreat. The next day, at Resaca de la Palma, the fighting turned into close combat among thickets and ravines. Texan and U.S. troops pushed the Mexicans back across the Rio Grande, capturing Matamoros soon after. These victories secured the contested territory, but Polk's ambitions reached far beyond Texas. The war quickly expanded into a full-scale invasion of Mexico. Taylor's army advanced south into Monterrey and then Saltillo, winning a series of hard-fought battles. In the east, General Winfield Scott launched an amphibious landing at Veracruz, one of the first of its kind in U.S. military history, and began a march inland toward Mexico City. Meanwhile, U.S. forces in the west seized California and moved into New Mexico, cutting deep into Mexican territory on multiple fronts. Texas's role in the wider war was significant, but also complicated. The state served as a staging ground for troops and supplies, with ports like Galveston and Corpus Christi buzzing with military activity. Overland routes carried men, weapons, and provisions toward the Rio Grande and beyond. Texan volunteers fought not only in the early border battles, but also in campaigns deeper in Mexico, from Monterrey to Buena Vista. Some sought vengeance for the Alamo and Goliad. Others were drawn by the promise of adventure or the prospect of land grants as payment for their service. The war was brutal on both sides. Disease claimed more lives than combat, with yellow fever, dysentery, and other illnesses cutting through camps. Supply lines were long and often unreliable, and soldiers endured extreme heat, dust, and shortages. Civilians in the contested regions, Mexican, Tejano, and Anglo alike, found themselves caught between advancing and retreating armies, their homes raided for food, livestock, or shelter. As the U.S. advanced, the political situation in Mexico grew more desperate. Santa Anna returned from exile to take command, rallying Mexican forces for a series of defensive battles. At Buena Vista in February 1847, his army confronted Taylor's smaller force in the mountain passes of northern Mexico. The fighting was fierce and costly, but the Americans held their ground, forcing Santa Anna to withdraw. The battle cemented Taylor's reputation as a national hero and would later help propel him to the presidency. Back in Texas, news of the victories fueled pride, but the war also brought tension. The heavy U.S. military presence in the state created friction between federal forces and local authorities. There were also reports of misconduct by volunteer units, including looting and violence against civilians in occupied areas. These incidents tarnished the image of the Texan fighter in some quarters, even as their contributions to the war effort remained undeniable. By the autumn of 1847, U.S. forces had captured Mexico City after a series of bloody engagements at places like Cerro Gordo, Contreras, Churubusco, and Chapultepec. The Mexican government, unable to continue the fight, entered negotiations. The resulting Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed on February 2, 1848, ended the war and reshaped the map of North America. For Texas, the treaty brought the recognition it had sought for more than a decade. Mexico formally acknowledged the Rio Grande as the southern boundary, settling the dispute that had helped ignite the war. The contested land between the Nueces and the Rio Grande was now unquestionably part of Texas. But the treaty went far beyond Texas, ceding vast territories to the United States, including present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Oklahoma, in exchange for $15 million and the assumption of certain claims by U.S. citizens against Mexico. The new border at the Rio Grande transformed the geography and politics of Texas. Towns like Brownsville and Laredo, once peripheral outposts, now stood at the edge of an international boundary. Trade along the river increased as goods flowed north and south under the protection of the U.S. flag. But the change also brought new challenges. Families who had lived on both sides of the old, uncertain frontier now found themselves divided by a political line. Tejano communities, long accustomed to the fluidity of life between Texas and Mexico, had to navigate the reality of two nations with very different laws and governments. The war's end did not erase the bitterness between Mexico and Texas, nor did it resolve all disputes along the new border. Raids, smuggling, and occasional violence would remain part of life on the Rio Grande for years to come. But in the eyes of most Texans, the conflict had achieved its central goal. It had secured their place within the United States and established the boundary they had claimed since independence. In Washington, the victory was hailed as a triumph of expansion and national strength. In Texas, it was celebrated as the final act in a long struggle that had begun in the days of Gonzales and the Alamo. Yet the acquisition of so much new territory also reignited the divisive national debate over slavery, setting the stage for new conflicts that would one day shake the Union itself. For now, though, the Rio Grande flowed as the recognized border between Texas and Mexico, its muddy waters marking both an end and a beginning. The war had been fought for borders, but its legacy went far beyond lines on a map. It had bound Texas more tightly into the United States, confirmed its claims, and placed it at the very edge of a new American frontier, a frontier that would continue to shape its destiny for generations. And while the guns fell silent in 1848, the story of Texas's next chapter would show that peace along the Rio Grande was never something to be taken for granted. Chapter 10. Texas in the Civil War. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo had secured Texas's borders and its place in the Union, but the peace that followed was fragile. The national debate over slavery, already simmering during the war with Mexico, only deepened in the years that followed. Texas, with its vast lands suited for cotton cultivation and its strong economic ties to the plantation South, quickly became a firm part of the pro-slavery bloc. The state's identity as a frontier land of opportunity was bound tightly to the institution of slavery, and that reality would shape its course in the crisis to come. By the late 1850s, sectional tensions between North and South had reached a fever pitch. Debates in Washington over the extension of slavery into new territories were fierce, and every compromise seemed only to delay a greater conflict. In Texas, newspapers and politicians warned that Northern abolitionists sought to undermine their way of life and destroy the economic foundation of the state. Many Texans saw their future as inseparable from that of the slave-holding South, and they viewed the growing Republican movement with suspicion and hostility. When Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860, without winning a single Southern electoral vote, the sense of alienation in Texas deepened into alarm. Lincoln's platform opposed the expansion of slavery into the territories, which many in the South interpreted as the first step toward its eventual abolition. Across the South, states began to call conventions to consider secession from the Union. In Texas, Governor Sam Houston stood almost alone in opposing secession. A hero of the Revolution and a staunch Unionist, Houston believed that leaving the United States would bring disaster. He argued that Texas, with its independent spirit and strong position, could act as a mediator between North and South. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The secession movement in Texas was swift and decisive. In January 1861, a convention of delegates voted overwhelmingly to leave the Union. The decision was submitted to the voters, and in February, it was approved by a wide margin. On March 2, 1861, the 25th anniversary of Texas's Declaration of Independence from Mexico. The state formally joined the Confederate States of America. Houston refused to take the oath of loyalty to the Confederacy and was removed from office, replaced by Lieutenant Governor Edward Clark. Texas's entry into the Confederacy committed it to the Southern cause, and the state quickly mobilized. Thousands of men volunteered for Confederate service, forming regiments that would fight in battles from Virginia to New Mexico. Texas troops gained a reputation for toughness and mobility, often serving as cavalry. Units like Hood's Texas Brigade became legendary in the Army of Northern Virginia, earning praise from General Robert E. Lee himself. But the Civil War was not fought only on distant battlefields. Texas had its own theaters of conflict, though they were smaller in scale. The Union sought to blockade the Gulf Coast to cut off Confederate trade, leading to naval clashes near Galveston and other ports. In 1863, Union forces captured Galveston, but a daring Confederate counterattack on New Year's Day drove them out, restoring Confederate control of the city for the remainder of the war. Along the Rio Grande, the Confederacy maintained a vital trade route through Mexico, allowing cotton to be exported and war supplies to be imported, despite the Union blockade. In the West, Texas forces clashed with Union troops in New Mexico Territory in the ill-fated 1862 campaign led by General Henry Hopkins Sibley. The goal was to seize the Southwest for the Confederacy, but defeat at the Battle of Glorieta Pass forced the Texans to retreat, ending hopes of expansion in that direction. While soldiers fought far from home, life on the Texas home front was marked by scarcity and sacrifice. The Union blockade caused shortages of manufactured goods, leading Texans to improvise with homegrown substitutes. Salt, crucial for preserving meat, became scarce, and women often boiled down salty earth from stock pens to recover it. Coffee was replaced by roasted corn or okra seeds, and clothing was patched and repatched until it could be worn no more. The war years also brought social tensions. Not all Texans supported the Confederacy. German immigrants in the Hill Country, many of whom opposed slavery, resisted Confederate conscription and faced violent reprisals. In 1862, a group of Unionist Germans attempting to flee to Mexico was attacked in the Nueces Massacre, an incident that left deep scars in the region. Enslaved people in Texas, though largely cut off from Union lines, followed the progress of the war closely, sensing that its outcome could determine their freedom. By 1864, the tide of war had turned decisively against the Confederacy. Union victories in the East and West tightened the blockade, strangled supply lines, and brought the fight ever closer to the South's heartland. In Texas, the war felt both distant and near. Distant because few major battles were fought on its soil. Near because the cost in lives, resources, and uncertainty weighed heavily on every household. In April 1865, the news of General Lee's surrender at Appomattox Courthouse reached Texas slowly, but the meaning was clear. The Confederacy was collapsing. Yet Texas would be the scene of one final, curious coda to the conflict. On May 13, 1865, more than a month after Lee's surrender, Union and Confederate forces clashed at the Battle of Palmito Ranch near Brownsville. Ironically, the Confederates won the skirmish, but it was meaningless. The war was already over. The end of the Civil War brought a new and uncertain era to Texas. The Emancipation Proclamation had technically freed enslaved people in Confederate-held territory in 1863. But in Texas, far from Union armies, slavery had continued largely unchanged until the war's conclusion. On June 19, 1865, Union General Gordon Granger arrived in Galveston and issued General Order No. 3, announcing that all enslaved people in Texas were free. The date became known as Juneteenth, celebrated in African American communities across the state as a second Independence Day. Freedom, however, did not mean equality. Reconstruction would bring its own struggles and conflicts as Texas navigated the transition from a slave-holding society to one in which formerly enslaved people sought to build lives as free citizens. The state was placed under military occupation, and its political leaders were required to take loyalty oaths to the Union. Efforts to rebuild the economy and integrate freed people into civic life met with resistance from many white Texans, leading to violence, intimidation, and the rise of discriminatory laws known as black codes. For veterans returning from the war, life was often grim. Farms and ranches had suffered from years of neglect, and the Confederate currency they had been paid in was worthless. Many struggled to adjust to the new social and economic order, while widows and families mourned the loss of thousands who had gone to fight and never returned. Yet, in the midst of hardship, there was also resilience. Freed people established churches, schools, and communities of their own, determined to claim the rights they had been promised. Railroads began to expand again, linking Texas more closely to the rest of the country. Cattle herds, which had roamed untended during the war, multiplied, setting the stage for a new economic boom in the years to come. The Civil War had changed Texas profoundly. Secession had carried it into a devastating national conflict. Confederate service had bound its fate to that of the South. The home front had endured shortages, divisions, and loss, and the war's end had brought the abolition of slavery and the uncertain promise of Reconstruction. The state emerged from the conflict battered but unbroken, standing at the threshold of yet another transformation, one that would reshape its economy, its society, and its place in the reunited United States. Chapter 11. Cattle, Cotton, and the Wild Frontier. When the guns of the Civil War fell silent, Texas stood at a crossroads. The state had survived the collapse of the Confederacy and the upheavals of Reconstruction, but its economy was battered and its society transformed. In the chaos of war, one thing had quietly multiplied across the open ranges: cattle. With many ranches left unattended and no large-scale slaughter or shipping during the conflict, the herds had grown far beyond their pre-war numbers. Longhorns roamed by the millions, tough, hardy animals descended from Spanish stock, perfectly adapted to the harsh landscapes of Texas. For ranchers and entrepreneurs, these herds were both a challenge and an opportunity. In Texas, a steer might be worth only a few dollars, but in the meat-hungry cities of the North and the mining camps of the West, the same animal could fetch $20, sometimes $30. The problem was getting them there. The railroads that could carry cattle to market did not yet reach deep into Texas, and the open ranges had no fences, making it impossible to simply hold stock in place until buyers came to them. The solution was as bold as it was arduous: cattle drives. Cowboys, a mix of former soldiers, Mexican vaqueros, freedmen, and young adventurers, gathered herds and pushed them north hundreds of miles to railheads in Kansas, Missouri, and beyond. The most famous of these routes became the Chisholm Trail, which ran from South Texas through Indian Territory and into Kansas. Named for trader Jesse Chisholm, who had first blazed much of the path, the trail became a river of hooves and dust, carrying Texas cattle to the railroads at Abilene, Ellsworth, and Dodge City. A cattle drive was no simple undertaking. A typical drive might involve 2,000 to 3,000 head, moving at a steady pace of 10 to 15 miles a day. The crew was small, often fewer than 20 men, led by a trail boss whose word was law. Flanking the herd were point riders guiding the lead cattle, flank riders keeping the sides tight, and drag riders bringing up the rear, eating the dust that hung thick in the hot air. At night, cowboys took turns circling the herd to keep the animals calm and watch for predators or stampedes. Stampedes were the cowboy's nightmare. A sudden noise, thunder, a rattlesnake, even a man's careless shout could send the herd surging in blind panic. Thousands of pounds of muscle and horn would crash forward, and the men had to ride hard to turn the lead animals and slow the charge before it scattered the herd across miles of prairie. It was dangerous work. Horses stumbled in holes, riders were thrown, and cattle could trample a man before he had time to cry out. The cowboy life, though romanticized in song and story, was grueling. Days began before dawn, with coffee brewed over a campfire and cold biscuits for breakfast. The hours in the saddle were long, the sun unrelenting, the wind and rain just as merciless. Nights might bring the relief of cool air, but also the risk of coyotes, rustlers, or restive cattle. Pay was modest, $30 to $40 a month for months on the trail. But for many, the job offered a sense of freedom, adventure, and camaraderie that was hard to find elsewhere. As the cattle trade grew, so did the towns along the trails. Abilene, under the guidance of entrepreneur Joseph McCoy, transformed almost overnight from a quiet settlement into a bustling cow town, complete with stockyards, rail lines, and a rowdy district of saloons and gambling halls to separate trail hands from their pay. Dodge City, Ellsworth, and Wichita followed suit, earning reputations as both gateways to the northern markets and hotbeds of vice and violence. The Chisholm Trail was not the only route. The Western Trail, the Shawnee Trail, and the Goodnight Loving Trail each carried herds across vast distances, opening new markets and new stories of hardship and grit. Legendary figures emerged from this world. Charles Goodnight, who pioneered routes into New Mexico and Colorado. Oliver Loving, his partner, whose death on the trail became part of cowboy lore. And countless nameless riders whose skills and courage kept the herds moving through storm, drought, and danger. While cattle brought new wealth and a new identity to Texas, cotton remained the state's other great economic engine. Before the Civil War, cotton had been king across the South, and Texas was no exception. The fertile soils of East Texas produced bumper crops, and even after emancipation ended the plantation system, cotton production rebounded. Freedmen often worked as sharecroppers, farming small plots in exchange for a share of the harvest, while landowners supplied seed, tools, and credit, terms that could be cripplingly unfair. Many sharecroppers found themselves trapped in cycles of debt, their profits eaten away by high interest rates and low cotton prices. The cotton economy was as volatile as it was vital. Good years brought prosperity to farmers and merchants alike. Bad years, when boll weevils or floods destroyed crops, could wipe out livelihoods. Global cotton markets meant that prices were at the mercy of forces far beyond Texas's borders. A bumper crop in Egypt or India could send prices plummeting in Galveston, just as a shortage elsewhere could spark a temporary boom. Despite these risks, cotton cultivation expanded westward, following the railroads and settlement into the prairies. New gins and warehouses sprang up in growing towns, and the bales moved to market along ever-improving rail lines. Galveston, the state's leading port, became a hub for both cotton exports and the import of manufactured goods, its wharves crowded with ships and its streets alive with traders from across the world. The boom in cattle and cotton reshaped Texas society. Fortunes were made in land, livestock, and trade, and new wealth flowed into banks, businesses, and civic projects. Yet the prosperity was uneven. While ranchers and large landowners prospered, many small farmers, freedmen, and laborers struggled to make ends meet. Towns along the frontier still faced the dangers of raids, feuds, and lawlessness. The frontier itself remained a place of both opportunity and peril. As settlers pushed deeper into West Texas, they encroached on land still claimed by Comanche, Kiowa, and other native nations. Skirmishes and raids flared into larger conflicts, prompting the U.S. Army to establish forts and patrols to protect settlers and supply lines. These clashes marked the closing years of native resistance in Texas, as military campaigns and dwindling resources forced many tribes onto reservations beyond the state's borders. In the open country, the line between lawman and outlaw could be thin. Cattle rustling was a constant threat, and disputes over land, water, or grazing rights sometimes ended in gunfire. Figures like John Wesley Hardin gained notoriety as gunfighters, their exploits exaggerated in newspapers and dime novels. At the same time, legendary lawmen such as the Texas Rangers worked to keep order, pursuing bandits, breaking up feuds, and patrolling the vast stretches where local law enforcement could not reach. By the late 1870s, the cattle boom was beginning to change. Barbed wire, patented in the 1870s, spread quickly across the state, allowing ranchers to fence off their land and control grazing. The open range began to vanish, and with it, the great trail drives that had defined a generation. Railroads pushed deeper into Texas, reducing the need for long, dangerous journeys to distant railheads. For many cowboys, the era of the open trail was ending, replaced by a new kind of ranching that was more settled but less free. Cotton, too, was entering a new phase. Mechanization slowly began to change the pace and scale of production, while the expansion of railroads opened distant markets to Texas farmers. But the boom and bust cycle remained, and dependence on a single cash crop left the state's agricultural economy vulnerable. Even in good years, the wealth generated by cotton and cattle often flowed into the hands of a few, while the majority labored on the margins. Yet for all its hardships and inequalities, this era left a powerful legacy. The image of the Texas cowboy, tough, independent, skilled in the saddle, became an enduring symbol not only for the state, but for the American West as a whole. The sprawling ranches, the bustling cotton ports, the frontier towns where saloons stood beside courthouses. These became part of the fabric of Texas identity. The wild frontier was not tamed overnight, nor was it ever as orderly as the boosters and railroad men liked to claim. But by the close of the 19th century, Texas had moved from the uncertain days after the Civil War into a period of growth and integration with the national economy. The trails still bore the faint tracks of the great herds, the gins still clattered in the cotton towns, and the legends of those years were already being told. Stories of endurance, ambition, and the relentless drive to carve a living from a land as vast and challenging as Texas itself. Chapter 12. Oil Changes Everything. By the dawn of the 20th century, Texas had already carved out a place in the American imagination. The cattle trails, the cotton fields, the dusty frontier towns. These were the images that defined it. The state's economy still rested on the twin pillars of agriculture and livestock, with railroads stitching together markets and ports humming with trade. Yet beneath the surface, in the dark strata far below the pastures and prairie, lay a resource that would upend the old order entirely. It waited, pressurized and potent, until a January morning in 1901 when it erupted into history. That morning, on a low hill just south of Beaumont, a well named Lucas No. 1 roared to life. For weeks, the crew had been drilling through stubborn rock and clay, guided by the stubborn belief of one man. Anthony F. Lucas, a mining engineer convinced there was oil beneath the salt dome at a place called Spindletop. Skeptics had called him foolish. The few wells drilled in the area before had yielded little more than disappointment. But Lucas and his backers pressed on, driving the bit deeper and deeper, until, at 1,139 feet, they struck the pressurized reservoir. The result was like nothing anyone had seen before. Oil burst from the ground with a force that shattered the derrick, shooting a black column more than 100 feet into the air. It didn't stop after a few seconds, or even a few minutes. For 9 days, the gusher poured out an estimated 100,000 barrels a day, creating a river of crude that coated the earth for acres around. Men cheered, newspapers raced to print extras, and the world took notice. Texas had oil, and in quantities that defied imagination. Spindletop changed everything overnight. Investors flooded into Beaumont, their eyes fixed on the promise of quick fortunes. The quiet town of 9,000 people swelled as prospectors, drillers, merchants, and swindlers poured in. Tent cities sprang up, boarding houses overflowed, and muddy streets clogged with wagons hauling timber, machinery, and supplies. Within weeks, dozens of rigs crowded the salt dome, each one a gamble that lightning might strike twice. Some did, many didn't. But the fever was contagious. The oil industry in Texas had existed before Spindletop. Wells had been drilled in Corsicana and other parts of the state in the 1890s. But they were modest compared to what came in 1901. Spindletop's scale and production were unprecedented, proving that Texas held reserves capable of competing with the established oil fields of Pennsylvania and Ohio. The implications reached far beyond state lines. Oil was no longer just a source of lamp fuel. It was becoming the lifeblood of a new industrial age. Automobiles, powered by the internal combustion engine, were beginning to roll off assembly lines. Factories, ships, and trains could all be fueled by petroleum. The demand seemed limitless, and Texas was poised to supply it. The boom brought a wave of new companies, some destined for greatness, others for obscurity. Out of the frenzy at Spindletop emerged names that would become giants: Gulf Oil, Texaco, Humble Oil, later Exxon. Many were born in small offices or hastily built shacks, financed by men who had been ranchers, cotton brokers, or storekeepers just months before. Fortunes were made at dizzying speed and lost just as quickly when wells ran dry or prices fell. Boom towns were the most visible symbol of the new era. Beaumont was the first, but not the last. Across Texas, wherever oil was struck, towns exploded overnight. Wooden derricks filled the horizon, their rhythmic pounding joined by the shouts of crews and the rumble of supply wagons. Streets were crowded with roughnecks in oil-stained overalls, businessmen in dusty suits, and women trying to keep shops, restaurants, and boarding houses running amid the chaos. The money brought theaters, banks, and schools, but it also brought saloons, gambling halls, and brothels. Law enforcement often struggled to keep pace. The oil fields were as dangerous as they were lucrative. Blowouts could turn a drilling site into an inferno in seconds. Workers handled heavy machinery with minimal safety equipment, and injuries were common. Yet the pay was better than most labor in Texas, and for many young men, it offered a way out of poverty. The roughneck culture that grew around the fields was one of hard work, hard drinking, and a willingness to take risks that mirrored the industry itself. Oil wealth began to seep into every corner of Texas life. Cities like Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth became centers of finance and corporate power, their skylines rising with new office towers. Oil money funded universities, hospitals, and public works. It built mansions and civic monuments, endowed charities, and underwrote political campaigns. The state government, too, would eventually benefit from oil revenue, particularly through the Permanent University Fund, which would help transform Texas higher education. Yet the transformation was not purely economic. Oil altered the very image of Texas. The cowboy still reigned in popular imagination, but now he shared the stage with the oil man, the figure in a Stetson and boots who struck it rich in the oil patch and dealt in millions as easily as cattle once had been traded by the head. The industry's reach extended far beyond the fields themselves, driving the growth of railroads, shipping, manufacturing, and construction. Booms, however, carried the seeds of busts. The flood of oil from Spindletop and other early fields drove prices down sharply. Wells that had seemed like inexhaustible fountains slowed or dried up. Investors who had rushed in expecting easy profits learned the hard realities of depletion and overproduction. But the industry adapted, using new drilling techniques, exploring new areas, and building pipelines to move oil to refineries and markets more efficiently. The technology evolved rapidly. Wooden derricks gave way to steel, drilling became more precise. Geologists began using seismic surveys to locate promising sites. Pipelines snaked across the state, tying far-flung fields to Gulf Coast refineries. The Port of Houston expanded dramatically, positioning itself as a major hub for petroleum exports. In the years following Spindletop, oil discoveries spread beyond Beaumont. Fields in Ranger, Burke Burnett, and Mexia set off their own booms, each with its own tales of luck, risk, and transformation. West Texas, once considered too dry and remote for much beyond ranching, would in time reveal its own vast reserves. The industry's reach was becoming truly statewide. The cultural footprint of oil was just as deep. The tales of sudden wealth became modern Texas legends. The farmer who struck oil and built a grand hotel. The driller who went from sleeping in a tent to driving a chauffeured car. The small-town banker who financed a wildcat well and ended up controlling a company worth millions. Newspapers and storytellers spun these accounts into the mythology of Texas success. Bold, risky, and outsized. Oil also brought Texas more firmly into the national and global economy. As the world's appetite for petroleum grew, the state became a crucial supplier, its fortunes tied to the price of crude and the geopolitics of energy. Texas oil fueled ships, trains, factories, and, increasingly, automobiles. It powered armies in wartime and economies in peacetime. The rise of the oil industry did not erase Texas's agricultural heritage, but it shifted the balance of power and wealth. Cotton and cattle still mattered, but oil was the commodity that could create instant millionaires and finance projects on a scale never before imagined in the state. It was volatile, unpredictable, and at times ruthless. But it offered rewards that no other industry could match. By the second decade of the 20th century, the shock of Spindletop had settled into a new reality. Texas was no longer just a land of open ranges and farm fields. It was an oil state, its economy, politics, and identity transformed by the resource that had burst from the ground that January morning. The derricks, the pipelines, and the refineries became as much a part of the landscape as the mesquite and the longhorn. And in the years to come, oil would not only fuel machines, it would fuel the ambitions of a state that now saw its future as wide open as the sky over the Texas plains. Chapter 13. Depression, Dust, and War Again. By the late 1920s, Texas was riding high on the wealth of its oil fields, the resilience of its cattle industry, and the enduring reach of cotton. Cities like Houston, Dallas, and Fort Worth were rising in stature, and the ports of Galveston and Corpus Christi bustled with trade. Yet the prosperity that seemed so secure was more fragile than many realized. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, the shock waves rippled across the country, and Texas was no exception. The Great Depression tightened its grip quickly. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment surged. In rural Texas, falling crop prices hit farmers hardest. Cotton, still a cornerstone of the state's economy, fell from more than 20 cents a pound to less than 6. A year's labor might not earn enough to pay a store debt, and many sharecroppers found themselves owing more to landowners and merchants than they could ever repay. Farm foreclosures became common, and families packed their belongings into wagons or battered trucks in search of work elsewhere. In the oil fields, the downturn brought its own kind of collapse. Overproduction had already driven prices down, and with the Depression's onset, crude oil sold for pennies a barrel. Small operators went under, and even the largest companies scaled back drilling. Towns that had sprung up overnight during the boom now emptied almost as fast, their hotels and boarding houses standing vacant, their streets quiet except for the wind. Nature, however, had its own disaster in store for Texas. In the early 1930s, years of poor agricultural practices combined with severe drought to produce one of the worst environmental catastrophes in American history: the Dust Bowl. In the Panhandle and across the southern plains, farmers had plowed under the deep-rooted prairie grasses that once held the soil in place, replacing them with crops that left the ground bare after harvest. When the rains failed, the earth dried and turned to fine dust. Winds lifted it into the air and carried it for miles, darkening skies and coating everything in a layer of grit. Dust storms became a regular terror. They blotted out the sun at midday, turning the world into a dim, choking haze. Dust sifted into houses, no matter how tightly windows and doors were sealed. It clogged machinery, killed livestock, and left children coughing through the handkerchiefs. The worst of the storms, remembered as black blizzards, rolled across the plains like moving walls hundreds of feet high. Farmers who had managed to survive the economic crash now watched their land literally blow away. The devastation drove thousands of Texans, along with neighbors from Oklahoma, Kansas, and New Mexico, to abandon their farms and head west. They became part of the great migration to California, immortalized in stories and photographs that showed weary families crowded into trucks, their faces lined with dust and worry. In California, they were often called Okies, regardless of where they came from, and they faced harsh working conditions and resentment from locals. Back in Texas, the government's response to the twin crises of depression and dust began to make a difference by the mid-1930s. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal programs brought relief money, jobs, and new infrastructure to the state. The Civilian Conservation Corps planted shelter belts of trees to break the wind, while the Soil Conservation Service promoted new farming techniques to preserve topsoil. Public works projects built roads, schools, and dams, including the massive Mansfield Dam near Austin, which would help control flooding and provide hydroelectric power. The oil industry, too, began to recover. The Texas Railroad Commission, empowered to regulate production, limited output to stabilize prices. A move that not only revived profits, but also became a model for managing oil markets worldwide. The steady demand for petroleum, even during hard times, gave Texas an advantage many other states lacked. Oil money continued to flow into public and private ventures, softening some of the Depression's harsher blows. As the 1930s drew to a close, another force began to reshape Texas: the growing shadow of global war. The rise of militarism in Europe and Asia, and the outbreak of conflict in 1939, stirred the U.S. to begin rearming long before it officially entered World War II. Texas's vast open spaces, mild climate, and existing infrastructure made it an ideal location for military training bases. Camp Bowie, Camp Hood, and other installations sprang up or expanded, bringing thousands of soldiers, construction workers, and civilian employees. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and the United States declared war, Texas was ready to play a central role in the nation's mobilization. Military bases multiplied across the state, from airfields in the Panhandle to naval stations along the Gulf Coast. The new Camp Hood, later Fort Hood, became one of the largest armored training facilities in the world, preparing tank crews for combat in North Africa and Europe. Texans answered the call to service in large numbers. More than 750,000 men and women from the state joined the armed forces during the war, serving in every theater. Many fought in famous units, from the 36th Infantry Division, which saw heavy action in Italy and France, to the 2nd Marine Division, which stormed Pacific Islands. The state also produced celebrated heroes, such as Audie Murphy, the sharecropper's son from Farmersville, who became one of the most decorated American soldiers of the war. On the home front, Texas's economy surged as wartime demand transformed its industries. Shipyards in Houston, Beaumont, and Orange turned out Liberty ships and warships. Aircraft plants in Fort Worth and Dallas produced bombers and fighters. Oil fields pumped at record rates, fueling the tanks, planes, and ships of the Allied forces. Cotton was once again in demand for uniforms, tents, and other military supplies. The Depression's unemployment vanished almost overnight, replaced by labor shortages in some areas. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers, taking jobs in factories, offices, and farms. Rosie the Riveter had her Texas counterparts, from welders in shipyards to machinists in aircraft plants. African Americans and Mexican Americans also found new opportunities in war industries, though they often faced discrimination in pay, promotion, and housing. The war years began to lay the groundwork for future struggles over civil rights and equality. Rationing became part of daily life. Families saved gasoline, rubber, and scrap metal. They grew victory gardens to supplement food supplies. They bought war bonds to support the effort. Schools held drives to collect tin cans and paper. The sense of unity and purpose, while sometimes strained by shortages and sacrifices, bound communities together in a way that echoed the frontier days of shared struggle. By 1945, the war's end brought celebration, but also change. Many returning veterans used the GI Bill to attend college, buy homes, or start businesses, helping to fuel post-war growth. Military installations remained important employers, and some of the wartime industries continue to operate, diversifying Texas's economy beyond its traditional dependence on agriculture and oil. The state had weathered the Depression and the Dust Bowl, and emerged from the war more urban, more industrial, and more connected to the wider world than ever before. Yet the memory of those hard years lingered. In the Panhandle, older residents could still recall the taste of dust in their teeth, the way it sifted into flour bins and water buckets. In the cotton fields, sharecroppers remembered the long struggle to survive when prices collapsed and landlords held all the power. And in the oil towns, veterans of the 1930s bust knew how quickly a boom could turn to bust, and how dangerous it was to take prosperity for granted. The Depression, the Dust Bowl, and the war had reshaped Texas in ways both visible and invisible. They had tested its resilience, forced it to adapt, and pushed it into a new role on the national stage. The state that emerged in the late 1940s was not the same Texas that had entered the 1930s. It was more modern, more complex, and ready to face a future in which its fortunes would be tied to forces far beyond its borders. But that future would bring challenges of its own. As the state moved into a post-war era of rapid change, political shifts, and cultural transformation. Chapter 14. Post-War Texas, Growth and Change. The guns of World War II had barely fallen silent before Texas began to feel the first tremors of a new era. The war had transformed the state, turning its ports, oil fields, shipyards, and military installations into vital cogs in the machinery of victory. Now, as the soldiers returned and the war industries shifted to peacetime production, Texas stood on the threshold of profound change. It would move from a mostly rural, agriculture-centered society to one increasingly urban, industrial, and interconnected with the rest of the nation. A transformation that would redefine what it meant to be Texan. In 1945, Texas still bore the marks of its past. Cotton fields stretched across the plains, cattle grazed in vast pastures, and oil derricks stood like sentinels over the Gulf Coast and the Permian Basin. But war had accelerated trends that were already reshaping the state. Returning veterans came home with new skills, new expectations, and in many cases, access to the GI Bill, which provided money for education and home loans. This opened doors to opportunities far beyond the farm or ranch. Many veterans chose to settle in the cities, where the jobs were plentiful and life seemed to promise a modern future. Urbanization picked up speed. Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth, and San Antonio grew rapidly, their skylines climbing higher with each passing year. Houston, which had already established itself as a major port and oil hub, began to emerge as the energy capital of the nation. The Houston Ship Channel, expanded during the war, became a superhighway for petroleum exports and imports, feeding the city's refineries and chemical plants. The headquarters of major oil companies clustered in gleaming office towers, and the money they generated flowed into banks, real estate, and civic projects. Dallas, meanwhile, built on its reputation as a commercial and financial center. Its central location and strong transportation network, railroads, highways, and increasingly air travel, made it a crossroads for trade. The city's business elite fostered a culture of corporate growth, and new industries, from electronics to insurance, took root. The Dallas-Fort Worth area began to function as a single economic region, a partnership that would only deepen in the decades ahead. San Antonio retained its unique blend of military, tourism, and commerce. The city's military bases, including Fort Sam Houston and Lackland Air Force Base, remained major employers. The Alamo and the River Walk drew visitors from across the country, blending history and hospitality in a way that kept San Antonio's cultural heritage alive, while also fueling economic growth. While the big cities boomed, smaller towns adapted in their own ways. Some became bedroom communities for the expanding urban areas. Others specialized in niche industries, from food processing to manufacturing. Rural Texas did not vanish, but it was changing. Mechanization in agriculture meant fewer workers were needed to plant, tend, and harvest crops. Families who had farmed for generations sold their land or left it to be managed by larger operators, and their children sought futures in town or city. The shift from rural to urban life was mirrored in the state's politics. For decades, Texas had been dominated by the Democratic Party, a holdover from Reconstruction and the resentment many Texans felt toward the Republican-led federal government after the Civil War. But the post-war years brought cracks to this one-party dominance. A new generation of leaders began to emerge, some more moderate, others increasingly conservative, reflecting the growing influence of business interests and suburban voters. National politics also began to make inroads. The 1952 and 1956 presidential elections saw Texas support Republican Dwight D. Eisenhower, signaling that the state was not as politically monolithic as it had once been. The seeds of future party realignment were being planted, though it would take decades for the full shift to occur. The post-war years were also a time of growing awareness and activism among groups long marginalized in Texas life. African Americans, many of whom had served in the military during the war, returned determined to claim the rights they had defended abroad. In 1944, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down Texas's all-white Democratic primary in Smith v. Allwright, opening the door to greater political participation. Mexican Americans, too, began to organize more forcefully, challenging segregation in schools and public facilities and fighting for equal access to jobs and housing. Organizations like the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC, gained momentum, laying the groundwork for the civil rights battles to come. Economically, the diversification of Texas was underway. Oil remained king, but other industries were growing fast. The petrochemical industry, fueled by Gulf Coast oil and gas, expanded dramatically, producing plastics, synthetic rubber, and other materials that had been crucial during the war and were now finding peacetime uses. Aerospace and defense-related industries found a home in Texas as well, especially in Fort Worth, where Consolidated Vultee, later Convair, produced military aircraft, and in Houston, which would soon be chosen as the site for NASA's Manned Spacecraft Center. Education became a priority, driven by both the GI Bill and a recognition that the state's future prosperity depended on a skilled workforce. Universities expanded their campuses, added new programs, and saw record enrollments. The University of Texas and Texas A&M grew into nationally recognized institutions, while regional colleges blossomed into full-fledged universities. Public school systems, too, had to adapt to the influx of students from the baby boom generation, building new schools and hiring more teachers. The cultural identity of Texas in the post-war years was an intricate blend of tradition and modernity. The cowboy remained a powerful symbol, celebrated in rodeos and Western films. But the oil man, the businessman, and the urban professional joined him as icons of Texan success. Country music thrived alongside jazz, blues, and the emerging strains of rock and roll. Television brought images of Texas into homes across America, shaping how outsiders saw the state and how Texans saw themselves. Transportation networks reinforced the shift toward a modern, interconnected Texas. Highways built under the Federal Interstate Program linked the state's cities more closely than ever before, making it easier to move goods, services, and people. airlines expanded their routes through Dallas and Houston, further integrating Texas into national and international markets. The sense of distance that had once defined so much of Texas life was shrinking, replaced by the immediacy of the modern age. Yet amid all the growth and optimism, there were undercurrents of challenge. The rapid pace of change left some communities behind. Small towns that could not adapt to the new economy faced decline. The benefits of prosperity were unevenly distributed, and racial and economic inequalities persisted. Political debates over states' rights, federal power, and social change began to simmer, foreshadowing conflicts that would intensify in the decades ahead. Still, the overall trajectory was clear. Texas was no longer simply a state defined by its frontier past. It was a player in the modern American story, with a dynamic economy, expanding cities, and a population that was increasingly diverse in both background and outlook. The post-war generation embraced the possibilities of the future, even as it held fast to the symbols and stories that had defined the state for more than a century. By the dawn of the 1960s, the outlines of modern Texas were in place. Skyscrapers towered over streets that bustled with traffic. Universities turned out graduates who would lead in business, science, and public service. The oil fields still pumped, the ranches still grazed cattle. But the state's wealth now came from boardrooms, laboratories, and assembly lines as much as from the land itself. A new Texas identity was taking shape, one that honored the grit of its past while embracing the possibilities of a rapidly changing world. Chapter 15: The Texas Myth and the Texas Reality. By the time Texas entered the latter half of the 20th century, its image had grown far beyond its borders. The state was no longer just a place on a map. It was an idea, a character in the American imagination. In films, television, music, and politics, Texas loomed larger than life. It was cattle and oil, wide open plains and glittering cities, swagger and independence, grit and glamour. This Texas was familiar to millions who had never set foot in the state. But whether it matched the truth depended entirely on where you stood. The roots of the Texas myth reached back into the 19th century, when tales of the Alamo, the open range, and the cowboy life began to circulate in dime novels and traveling shows. By the mid-20th century, Hollywood had taken up the torch. Western films were the first major architects of the image, and they loved Texas. On screen, Texas was the backdrop for heroic showdowns, rugged cattle drives, and stoic lawmen facing down outlaws under a blazing sun. The cowboy, whether portrayed by John Wayne, Gary Cooper, or younger Clint Eastwood, embodied the values Americans liked to associate with Texas: independence, courage, and self-reliance. But the movies were selective storytellers. They seldom showed the diversity of Texas life or the complexity of its history. Mexican Americans, Native peoples, and African Americans, central to the real story of Texas, often appeared only as stereotypes or not at all. Women, too, were usually cast as side characters, the ones waiting back at the homestead while the men faced danger. The myth simplified, streamlined, and polished the rough edges into something audiences could cheer for. Television picked up the myth-making and gave it new life. In the 1970s and 80s, the world was introduced to the Ewings of Dallas, a primetime soap opera centered on an oil-rich family whose intrigues, betrayals, and boardroom battles played out against a backdrop of sprawling ranch houses and glittering skylines. To millions of viewers around the globe, Texas became synonymous with oil wealth, big hats, and even bigger egos. The show's famous Who Shot J.R. cliffhanger captivated audiences worldwide, cementing Dallas, the city and the idea, as a symbol of ambition, money, and drama. Country music also carried the Texas myth far and wide. Singers like Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and George Strait told stories of honky-tonk heartbreak, wide-open highways, and small-town pride. The music celebrated both the rural roots of the state and the independent spirit of its people. The outlaw country movement of the 1970s, with its rejection of Nashville Polish, reinforced the idea that Texans did things their own way, answering to no one but themselves. Politics added its own chapters to the myth. Figures like Lyndon B. Johnson, who rose from the Texas Hill Country to the presidency, and George W. Bush, whose Texas ranch became a symbol of his public persona, each projected their own version of Texan identity to the world. In politics, as in entertainment, Texas was often presented as bold, decisive, and unapologetically independent. A state that could go its own way even when the rest of the country was headed in a different direction. The myth, of course, had its truths. Texas really does have sweeping landscapes that can take your breath away. It really does produce tough, self-reliant people, shaped by a history of frontiers and challenges. The oil boom did make instant millionaires, and ranches still cover thousands of acres. The food, from slow-smoked brisket to spicy chili to fresh Gulf seafood, really is as good as the stories say. And there's no denying that Texans, in general, have a strong sense of pride in their state. But the reality is more complicated. Texas is not just cowboys and oilmen. It's also scientists in Houston, tech workers in Austin, and artists in Marfa. Its landscapes range from pine forests in the east to mountains in the west, with sprawling suburbs and dense urban neighborhoods in between. The state is home to one of the largest and most diverse populations in the country, with cultural influences from Mexico, Germany, Africa, Vietnam, India, and countless other places. The myth tends to downplay the challenges and contradictions that have shaped modern Texas. The same oil industry that brought wealth also brought environmental concerns and economic volatility. The cowboy's open range was replaced long ago by barbed wire and real estate development. The independent spirit sometimes clashes with the practical needs of a state whose infrastructure, water supply, and economy are deeply interconnected with the rest of the nation and the world. In politics, the Texas myth often paints the state as monolithic, a conservative stronghold where rugged individualism reigns. In truth, Texas politics has always been a patchwork, with urban centers leaning one way, rural areas another, and shifting coalitions forming around issues as varied as immigration, education, and energy policy. The state that produced Lyndon Johnson also produced Ann Richards, Barbara Jordan, and Ted Cruz, a range of voices that defy easy categorization. Pop culture has sometimes frozen Texas in an earlier time, but the reality is that the state changes constantly. Cities like Houston and Dallas have become global metropolises, attracting immigrants from every continent. Austin has grown into a tech hub and a center for music, film, and innovation. San Antonio blends deep historical roots with a vibrant, modern culture. These cities challenge the image of Texas as a land stuck in the past, showing instead a state that can evolve while holding on to its sense of identity. Still, the myth persists because it's compelling. It offers a shorthand for ideas people admire: freedom, resilience, boldness, even if they don't match every lived reality. For Texans, the myth can be a source of pride, a reminder of the qualities they want to embody. For outsiders, it can be an invitation to imagine a place where the horizon stretches endlessly, where anything seems possible. And sometimes, the myth and the reality meet in the same place. A rancher might drive a pickup to check his cattle in the morning, then join a video conference with a multinational energy company in the afternoon. A musician might play an old cowboy ballad at a honky-tonk on Friday night, then record an experimental track in a high-tech Austin studio on Saturday. A Houston oil executive might be just as passionate about barbecue and Friday night football as she is about global energy policy. In the end, the Texas myth and the Texas reality are not enemies. They're two sides of the same coin, each informing the other. The myth draws from real history and character, even if it smooths over some truths. The reality is enriched by the stories and symbols that give Texans a shared sense of belonging. Together, they create a state that is both a real place and a larger-than-life idea. One that continues to fascinate, frustrate, and inspire people from Amarillo to Austin, from El Paso to Paris. Chapter 16. Texas Today. The Texas of the 21st century is both instantly recognizable and constantly surprising. The outlines of the myth, the big skies, the bigger personalities, the enduring pride in the Lone Star flag are still there. But the reality has grown far more complex. The state is now home to more than 30 million people, making it the second most populous in the nation, and its economy ranks among the largest in the world. Its cities are vibrant hubs of technology, energy, medicine, culture, and trade. Yet at the same time, the cattle ranch, the oil rig, and the small-town Main Street remain powerful symbols, and in many places, a living reality. Modern Texas politics remain one of the most watched and debated arenas in the country. For decades, the state has been seen as a Republican stronghold, a shift that began in earnest in the late 20th century after more than a century of Democratic dominance. The conservative brand of Texas politics, emphasizing limited government, low taxes, and business-friendly regulations, has shaped national debates and sent its leaders to prominent positions in Washington. Figures like Rick Perry, Ted Cruz, and Greg Abbott have carried the state's political identity onto the national stage, championing policies that they argue reflect the independent spirit of Texas. Yet the political landscape is not as monolithic as the headlines sometimes suggest. The rapid growth of urban and suburban areas, fueled by migration from other states and abroad, has brought new perspectives and shifting demographics. Cities like Houston, Dallas, Austin, and San Antonio often lean Democratic, while rural regions and many smaller towns remain firmly conservative. This urban-rural divide has made Texas a political battleground in key races, with both major parties seeing opportunities to expand their influence. Election seasons bring intense campaigning, with issues like immigration, energy policy, public education, and healthcare sparking passionate debate. The Texas economy is as diverse as its population. Energy remains a cornerstone, but it is no longer defined solely by oil and gas. Wind power has become a major player, with Texas leading the nation in wind energy production. Solar capacity is expanding rapidly, particularly in the sun-drenched western part of the state. The energy sector is now a mix of traditional and renewable sources, reflecting both market forces and technological innovation. Technology, too, has found fertile ground in Texas. Austin's transformation into a tech hub, sometimes dubbed Silicon Hills, has drawn major companies and startups alike. Tesla moved its headquarters to the Austin area, Apple built a massive campus, and Dell Technologies founded in a University of Texas dorm room, remains a major employer. Dallas-Fort Worth has developed a strong telecommunications and aerospace presence, while Houston's energy corridor now shares space with a thriving healthcare and biomedical research sector anchored by the Texas Medical Center, the largest medical complex in the world. Agriculture still matters, even if its share of the economy has shrunk. Texas remains a leader in cattle, cotton, and other commodities, but modern agribusiness uses precision farming, advanced irrigation, and global supply chains to reach markets far beyond the state's borders. The ranching lifestyle, while romanticized, continues in a more efficient, business-oriented form, blending tradition with 21st century tools. Culturally, Texas today is a tapestry woven from countless threads. The state's Hispanic and Latino population, rooted in centuries of history and strengthened by recent immigration, now makes up nearly 40% of the population. African American communities, with deep roots in Texas history, remain vibrant cultural and political forces. Asian American populations, particularly in urban areas, have grown rapidly, bringing new languages, cuisines, and businesses. The result is a state where you can hear Spanish, Vietnamese, Mandarin, and dozens of other languages in daily life. Where a day's meals might include breakfast tacos, barbecue, pho, and kolaches, and where festivals celebrate everything from Juneteenth to Lunar New Year. This diversity is reflected in Texas's arts, music, and literature. Houston is home to a world-class opera, symphony, and ballet. Austin's music scene remains a magnet for performers and fans, from indie bands to country legends. San Antonio's cultural calendar blends Tejano traditions with global influences. Film festivals, book fairs, and art exhibitions draw international attention, while local traditions like high school football games still pack stadiums on Friday nights, binding communities together. Sports are another arena where Texas's modern identity shines. Professional teams, from the Dallas Cowboys and Houston Texans in football to the San Antonio Spurs in basketball, the Texas Rangers and Houston Astros in baseball, inspire fierce loyalty and statewide rivalries. College sports, especially football, remain a cultural force, with games at the University of Texas and Texas A&M drawing crowds that rival those of the NFL. The passion for competition extends beyond the big leagues, with youth leagues, rodeos, and local tournaments fostering community pride. The state's growth has brought challenges as well as opportunities. Rapid urban expansion has strained infrastructure, from highways to water systems. Housing prices have surged in booming cities, raising concerns about affordability. Debates over public education funding, property taxes, and health care access reveal the complexity of governing a state so large and varied. Environmental concerns, from hurricanes along the Gulf Coast to drought in the West, test the state's resilience and planning. Texas also finds itself at the heart of national conversations on immigration and border policy. With a long frontier shared with Mexico, border security and immigration reform are constant political flashpoints. Yet the same border region is also a space of deep cultural connection, where commerce, family ties, and shared history cross political boundaries. Cities like El Paso, Laredo, and Brownsville embody this dual reality, serving as both gateways and communities in their own right. Despite its challenges, the enduring spirit of Texas remains a constant, a blend of resilience, ambition, and pride. Texans tend to see obstacles as opportunities and changes as chances to prove themselves. This mindset has fueled responses to disasters, from rebuilding after hurricanes to innovating in times of economic downturn. It is a spirit rooted in the state's history of frontier survival, shaped by the struggles of ranchers, farmers, oil workers, and entrepreneurs, and carried forward by new generations who see Texas as a place where they can dream big and work hard to make those dreams real. In the global imagination, Texas continues to hold a special place. For some, it is the land of cowboy hats and cattle drives. For others, it is a high-tech powerhouse. For still others, it is a cultural crossroads unlike any other. The truth, as always, is that Texas is all of these things at once, and more. It is a state that contains multitudes, where tradition and innovation live side by side, and where the horizon always seems just a little farther away, beckoning those willing to chase it. The Texas of today is not the Texas of the Alamo, the cattle drives, or Spindletop, though it carries pieces of all those eras in its heart. It is a modern, complex, and dynamic place, a state confident in its past and unafraid of its future, still flying the lone star high as a symbol of unity, independence, and the unshakable belief that in Texas, anything is possible. Chapter 17. The Future of Texas. The Texas of today stands at a threshold. Its history has been written in bold strokes: revolutions and cattle drives, oil gushers and boom towns, political battles and cultural renaissances. But what lies ahead for the Lone Star State may be even more consequential than anything that has come before. The forces shaping Texas in the 21st century are immense. Relentless population growth, profound shifts in the energy landscape, the challenges and opportunities of a long and dynamic border, and the question of how to balance tradition with change in an era that moves faster than ever. Population growth is the most visible and immediate transformation. Texas adds more than 1,000 people a day, a tide fed by both natural increase and migration from across the country and around the globe. Californians, Floridians, and New Yorkers arrive seeking lower costs and new opportunities. Immigrants from Mexico, Central America, Asia, and Africa bring languages, cuisines, and customs that add to the state's already rich diversity. The result is a Texas that is younger, more multicultural, and more urban than at any other time in its history. Cities are expanding at a staggering pace. The Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex now sprawls across multiple counties, its suburbs merging into one another in a landscape of highways, industrial parks, and planned communities. Houston, already the largest city in Texas, continues to stretch outward into forests and bayous, its port handling a growing share of global trade. Austin, once a sleepy college town, has transformed into a magnet for technology and culture, its skyline bristling with cranes and new towers. San Antonio grows steadily, anchored by military, medical, and tourism industries, while smaller cities like Frisco, McAllen, and Midland see growth rates that rival their larger counterparts. This expansion brings prosperity, but also strain. Infrastructure built for smaller populations now struggles to keep pace. Highways choke with traffic, water systems stretch to serve more customers, and power grids face increasing demand. The memory of the 2021 winter storm, when much of the state lost power in a deadly deep freeze, lingers as a reminder that growth without resilience can be dangerous. Policymakers, engineers, and communities grapple with how to prepare for a future in which millions more will call Texas home. Energy will remain central to that future, but not in the same way it has for the last century. Texas is still the leading oil and gas producer in the United States. and the Permian Basin remains one of the most productive oil fields in the world. Yet the global push toward decarbonization and renewable energy is already reshaping the landscape. Wind power, which began modestly on the plains of West Texas, has grown into a giant, with thousands of turbines turning out enough electricity to power millions of homes. Solar farms are spreading rapidly, especially in the sun-baked stretches of West and South Texas. The transition is not about replacing one industry with another overnight, but about diversification, ensuring that Texas remains an energy leader in whatever form energy takes. Oil companies are investing in carbon capture, hydrogen production, and renewable projects alongside traditional drilling. Entrepreneurs are building businesses around battery storage, electric vehicle infrastructure, and grid modernization. The challenge will be managing this shift in a way that sustains the economic benefits of energy, while addressing environmental concerns and the realities of climate change. No discussion of Texas's future can ignore its border. The 1,254-mile frontier with Mexico is both a political flashpoint and an economic lifeline. Trade through ports of entry like Laredo, El Paso, and Brownsville fuels billions in commerce, from auto parts to agricultural goods. Families and communities on both sides share deep cultural ties that predate the modern border itself. Yet, immigration policy, border security, and humanitarian crises continue to dominate headlines and divide opinion. The future of Texas will depend in part on how it navigates this complex relationship. Investments in border infrastructure, streamlined trade agreements, and cooperation with Mexican states could strengthen economic growth, while humane and effective immigration policies could better integrate newcomers into the social and economic fabric. At the same time, Texas will need to balance security concerns with the recognition that the border is not just a line. It is a living, breathing region where identities and economies overlap. The state's political trajectory will also shape what comes next. Demographic changes, shifting economic priorities, and generational turnover are creating new political dynamics. Younger voters, more diverse in background and often more urban in outlook, are beginning to exert greater influence. Longtime residents, especially in rural areas, remain deeply committed to traditional values and political conservatism. Whether Texas remains a reliable Republican stronghold or evolves into a competitive swing state will depend on how these forces interact over the coming decades. Beyond politics and economics, there is the question of how Texas will define itself in a rapidly changing world. Will it cling to the myths that have served as symbols for generations? Or will it embrace a more complex identity that reflects the realities of its diverse population and modern industries? In some ways, it has already begun to do both. Keeping the cowboy hat while adding the tech startup, serving barbecue next to a Vietnamese pro shop, celebrating Juneteenth alongside rodeo season. Challenges will test the state's adaptability. Climate change is likely to bring more extreme weather, stronger hurricanes along the Gulf Coast, more intense droughts in the west, and searing heat in the summer. Water scarcity will be an especially pressing concern as cities grow and agriculture continues to demand large supplies. Education will remain a critical factor in sustaining economic growth, with debates over curriculum, funding, and access shaping the workforce of the future. And yet, if history is any guide, Texas has a habit of meeting challenges with boldness. The same resilience that carried settlers through frontier hardships, that rebuilt cities after hurricanes, that shifted from cattle to oil to technology, is still woven into the state's character. Its people, whether descended from the earliest native inhabitants, from Spanish settlers, from 19th-century immigrants, or from newcomers who arrived last week, share a tendency to think big and move fast. The future will likely bring more of what Texas has always had: opportunity and risk in equal measure. The population will keep growing. The economy will keep diversifying. The debates over identity, governance, and values will remain as spirited as ever. And the rest of the country and the world will keep watching. Because what happens in Texas has a way of echoing far beyond its borders. One day, the historians of the future may look back on the early decades of the 2000s as another turning point in the Texas story. A moment when the state once again reinvented itself, just as it had at the close of the frontier, at the dawn of the oil age, and in the boom years after World War. Whether the next chapter is defined by unity or division, by careful planning or headlong leaps into the unknown, will depend on the choices made now by its leaders and citizens alike. For Texans, the horizon remains both challenge and promise. The state's motto is a single word: friendship. Perhaps in that lies the key to navigating the future, a reminder that in a land this vast, with people this varied, the ability to work together may be as important as any resource drawn from the earth or skyline that scrapes the clouds. The Lone Star will keep flying, and Texas will keep moving forward. Its story still unfolding under the same wide sky that has witnessed every chapter before.